Warrior Lore. Chapter 2654. Huh? Junior Apprentice Brother Phone. Could it be that you can read my mind? How do you know that I'm going to give this to Junior Brother? Yutong's astonishment was slightly exaggerated as he shouted. Xiao Hua did not dare to be negligent and hurriedly urged the Buddha's Saraira to circulate the innate primordial water, blocking the large gap and revealing a small gap. He shouted, "Forget it, forget it. A gentleman does not take what others like. You just refine this thing. You'd better keep it for yourself." Ha ha ha, how can I do that? A gentleman's word is as fast as a horse's whip. I'll send Junior Brother Feng off now. Yutong laughed loudly. He raised his hand and the silver gourd flew into the air. Then, he pointed his finger at the gourd. Quick! 2 beams of light, one red and one green, flew out and pierced towards the azure sentient true water. Good boy! When Xiao Hua saw that the sword light had arrived in a flash, he cried out in alarm and immediately activated the innate primordial water, covering all the gaps. However, the moment the 2 sword lights came into contact with the innate primordial water, the brilliance of the sword lights flashed through the innate primordial water, completely unaffected by it. Damn it! Xiao Hua was shocked. The speed of the 2 rays of sword light was too fast, and it was even more nimble inside the innate primordial water. He could not help but shout. Looking at the 2 rays of sword light, they did not directly rush into the capital star's array. Instead, it rapidly circled around the formation. However, in just a few breaths of time, the sword light pierced through the weak point of the Dutian star formation with a buzzing sound. It immediately penetrated the formation and shot toward Xiao Hua's neck. Fight! Xiao Hua had already held the staff in his hand and did not hesitate to strike out. This was to send the 2 rays of sword light flying. However, just as the staff was about to touch the sword light slightly shook and cleverly dodged the staff. It did not allow Xiao Hua to do anything else and stabbed towards Xiao Hua's neck again. Shua! Xiao Hua's body flickered. It was the light protecting his body that was about to block the sword light. Unfortunately, the green and red sword light slashed through the light protecting Xiao Hua's body, and a crack was immediately cut open on the golden light. The golden light flickered and was about to collapse. Motherfucker! This so-called soul-punishing vital light. Isn't it too powerful? Xiao Hua couldn't help but groan. His soul was about to scatter. As the green and red sword lights intertwined, Xiao Hua's head was about to soar into the sky like jade ice. Right at this critical moment, Xiao Hua hastily opened his mouth, and 2 red and green rays of light flew out. The 2 rays of light were like bolts of lightning, and they actually blasted the yin-yang sword chi away with 2 light cracking sounds. However, the yin-yang sword chi wasn't simply formidable because it was a flying sword, and it was more due to the connection between the 2 rays of light. The swaying brilliance didn't seem to be blasted away by the rays of light, and it continued to coil around Xiao Hua's neck. When Yutong saw Xiao Hua's 2 flying swords, he was clearly stunned. However, it was only for a moment, and he didn't care. But then, he couldn't help but frown. After the 2 flying swords blasted away the 2 rays of light, their own swords also slanted. However, at the same time, shwa shwa shwa, a series of light sounds rang out. The 2 flying swords rapidly shook, and the 2 flying swords transformed into 4. The 4 flying swords then transformed again, and in the blink of an eye, 16 flying swords appeared out of thin air. These 16 flying swords were once again divided into 2 groups of green and red, and there were 8 of them each. They were right between Xiao Hua's neck, protecting him. Moreover, the moment the sword light extended, it hit the connection between the yin-yang sword chi. Kang! A sharp sound was extremely ear-piercing, like a sharp sword cutting through a hard rock. These 16 flying swords actually blocked the seemingly unstoppable yin-yang sword chi. His flying sword shadow technique. How do you know? Yutong sucked in a breath of cold air and almost cried out in alarm. Seeing that the Dream Executor and the Mountain Splitter had blocked the yin-yang sword spirit's sword light, Xiao Hua's heart calmed down. He looked left and right at the constellation array and the innate primordial water. He clenched his hand, and dozens of rays of light flashed, putting away the constellation array. Since Yu Tong had the means to break this great array, Xiao Hua's array could only be a hindrance. Oh! After Yu Tong recovered from his shock, he saw Xiao Hua put away the array. He raised his eyebrows and said coldly, "You're just a disciple of the Huan Hua sect. How could you know such a flying sword technique? Where did you come from? Take advantage of this moment to tell me. If you have something to do with me, I may not necessarily not let you live. Moreover, you seem to have used the metal escape technique just now. Presumably, you also know the secret of the silver tiger magic tool. How could an ordinary cultivator discover the secret of the silver tiger magic tool in such a short time? I won't hide it from you. What I want to do is very big, and I need a lot of help. I can consider cooperating with you. The secret inside the magic tool. You can have a share." As Yu Tong spoke, the yin-yang sword spirit retreated slightly and stopped in midair. At this time, the two flying swords were very strange. The two flying swords were only about the length of a finger and were incomparably sparkling and translucent. When one's gaze swept over the flying swords, they would appear and disappear. Even when one's divine sense was at the location, they would flicker indefinitely. They seemed to exist in midair, but also seemed to not exist in midair. Putting aside the green and red colors on the two flying swords, there were also a few strands of silvery white within the green and red colors. These green and red colors seemed to be alive. When the flying swords appeared, they moved around in an extremely orderly manner. At first glance, it was as if two eyes were showing an indescribable expression. At this time, Xiao Hua's two flying swords turned into 16 and lined up in front of him. They also overflowed with green and red colors, but it was very obvious that within the brilliance of the Dream Slayer and the Mountain Splitter, there was an abundance of baleful aura but not enough nimbleness. While listening to Yu Tong's persuasion, Xiao Hua's divine sense swept over the yin-yang sword spirit. He inwardly sighed that the yin-yang sword spirit, which was refined by Yu Qingtian and Zhang Yuhe's souls and sacrificed with the blood of nearly 100,000 creatures, was indeed fierce. At the same time, he inwardly pondered. He was somewhat puzzled by Yu Tong's words. What do you mean it has something to do with him? What do you mean by ordinary cultivators can't see through the secret of this magic tool? Could it be this guy already knew about the legacy realm mentioned in the magic tool? However, as a rogue cultivator, Xiao Hua had long heard this kind of affectionate persuasion to stay countless times. He had long seen this kind of heartfelt persuasion. Among these persuasion and persuasion, which one of them wasn't temporary? Which one of them wasn't a contest of strength? If I leave this formation, Xiao Hua coldly snorted. Would I still be afraid of you? However, Xiao Hua slightly changed his mind. When he thought of this, how could Yu Tong, who had been scheming against Zhang Yuhe for dozens of years, not know? He definitely wouldn't be at ease if he left. Moreover, when he thought about how Yu Tong and the others treated the 100,000 creatures as nothing and wantonly hunted them in order to increase their cultivation, even if he wanted to cooperate with someone, he absolutely wouldn't choose them. Ha ha ha, with this thought, Xiao Hua burst into laughter. I don't care what kind of bullshit person you are. I don't want to have any relationship with you. Previously, I avoided the battle because I didn't want to be nosy. Now that you insist on forcing me to make a move, don't blame me for being ruthless. Ha ha ha. Yu Tong's laughter seemed to be louder than Xiao Hua's. He also looked at Xiao Hua with interest and even said somewhat arrogantly, "Little guy, who doesn't know how to be overbearing? But you also need to have strength. Don't think that just because you know how to transform flying swords into shadows, you can be arrogant in front of me. I'll let you see what the soul-slaying primary light is." As he spoke, two flying swords as thin as cicadas' wings suddenly let out a rumbling sound. Yu Tong didn't seem to activate any spells, but they stabbed towards Xiao Hua. That kind of indescribable sharpness immediately pierced between Xiao Hua's eyebrows. "Who's afraid of you?" Xiao Hua pointed his finger. The 16 flying swords also moved in the air. There was some mysterious connection between them. Their flying speed was extremely fast, blocking in front of the oncoming yin-yang sword light. Whoosh! The green-red yin-yang sword light really did have intelligence. As if playing hide-and-seek, it casually weaved between the 16 flying swords. In the blink of an eye, it dodged the attacks of the Soul Slayer and the Mountain Slayer, and once again approached Xiaohua. Xiaohua's hand seals changed again. Whoosh, 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 a series of sounds rang out. 32, 64, and finally 128 sword lights flew out and blocked in front of the yin-yang sword light with extreme speed. As expected, you have some skill. Yu Tong beamed with joy. This was the first time Xiaohua had used 2 flying swords. 128 sword lights. At first, these 100 sword lights were somewhat clumsy, but following the urging of Xiaohua's divine sense, they gradually became orderly. These sword lights even faintly formed a sword array, encircling the yin and yang sword lights. Although the 2 flying swords with intelligence were incomparably nimble, they were unable to withstand the overwhelming number of swords. For the time being, they had no way of flying out. Not bad, not bad. In the distance, Yu Tong actually clapped his hands and praised. The Rinsing Flower sect actually has a disciple like you. This is really beyond my expectations. Not only that, Xiaohua raised his head and sneered, "Today, I'll let you see what this young master is capable of." While speaking, Xiaohua didn't seem to make any movements. The innate primordial water that previously surrounded Xiaohua suddenly surged with waves. Those waves condensed in midair, and like a fist, smashed towards Yu Tong. "Come on!" Yu Tong shouted loudly. His shoulders shook, and the true tiger Dharmakaya was released again. Roar! The true tiger Dharmakaya roared loudly, and a pair of fleshy wings flapped. Suddenly, out of nowhere, 2 silver-white brilliances gushed out. These brilliances were like clear springs rushing towards the innate primordial water. Boom! With a loud sound, the brilliances blocked the primordial water. The primordial water fell to the ground like a huge rock, hitting the defensive silver brilliance. With a loud sound, the primordial water suddenly scattered in all directions, and the silver brilliance was also shattered into pieces. Yu Tong's Dharmakaya is powerful. Xiaohua thought to himself. Fighting in this Buddhist gold formation, he has the absolute advantage. But so what? Xiaohua's Buddha Saraira once again activated the innate primordial water. This primordial water actually didn't condense, but instead turned into a net in midair, covering Yu Tong's head. -10. Chapter 26:55. Yu Tong's eyes flashed with astonishment. He looked at the 100 or so swords fighting with the yin and yang swords, then looked at the net of primordial water. He really didn't understand. For an ordinary golden core cultivator, controlling 100 sword lights with only his divine will was probably already his limit. Even if Xiaohua was far more powerful than an ordinary golden core cultivator, he could still split a part of his divine will to control the innate primordial water. However, that part of his divine will could only turn the innate primordial water into waves, but now, he could actually pull the innate primordial water into a net. The difference between this net and waves was not just a little bit. A complicated expression flashed through Yu Tong's eyes. The true tiger Dharma body spat out several mouthfuls of silver light, as well as the silver light from its fleshy wings, forming layers of defense in front of the primordial water. Rumble! Another earth-shattering collision sound rang out. The 2 of them were still evenly matched in their battle. Feng Ying. Yu Tong first called him Junior Martial Brother Feng from Martial Nephew Feng, and now he called him by his name. "I'm afraid your ability ends here. This young master will ask you one last time. Do you want to submit to this young master?" "Ha ha ha, Yu Tong, what ability do you have? You dare to make this young master submit?" At this time, Xiaohua didn't even use his sword art. He was laughing so hard that he swayed back and forth. Without the protection of the capital star array, he simply threw caution to the wind and prepared to fight against this peak late golden core, or even early nascent soul cultivator. Yu Tong's face gradually turned ashen, looking extremely unsightly. Previously, it was extremely easy to seize the position of falling Golden Mountain sect master, and even kill Zhang Yuhe, but the satisfaction had long disappeared. He coldly snorted and said, "This sect master saw that you were a talent, so this sect master cherished talent, and wanted to use you and the others as my wings. Since you don't want to choose the path of the sun, This young master will give it to you and Zhang Yuha." As he spoke, Yutong very solemnly waved his hand. His hands formed seals, and the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth swarmed over. Even some sword intent and sword chi from some places of the Buddhist gold great array were drawn over. After a moment, where the silver light flashed, a long spear about 10 feet long condensed. The spiritual energy inside the fist-thick spear shaft was so dense that it almost condensed into substance. "Go!" Yutong swung his spear as if it was light. The long spear emitted a fierce cry, swaying with a silvery white brilliance as it pierced towards Xiao Hua's chest. He had only flown a few feet when a powerful force was transmitted from the long spear. It seemed as if the surrounding air was about to be pierced through, making a chi-chi sound. Xiao Hua's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked coldly at the spear. When the spear was closer, he waved his hand and took out the wishful steel staff again. His figure swayed and flew up like a gust of wind, smashing towards the spear. Seeing Xiao Hua take out the wishful staff, Yutong's face showed a trace of regret. Obviously, he had forgotten about Xiao Hua's magic tool. However, this regret disappeared in a flash. Immediately after, Yutong's fingers moved like he was playing a pipa. A few silver-white rays of light arrived first and hit the long spear. Woo-woo! The long spear let out an extremely loud cry and suddenly transformed. Just like Xiao Hua's flying sword, it suddenly turned into 4 spears and stabbed towards Xiao Hua from 4 different angles. How could Xiao Hua be afraid of this? The wishful steel staff in his hand danced elegantly. With a series of pong-pong-pong sounds, the long spear was actually broken into pieces by Xiao Hua. The powerful force on the long spear seemed to have no effect on Xiao Hua at all. Looking at the dancing sword light, then looking at the fierce collision between the innate real water and the real tiger dharma body, and then looking at Xiao Hua waving the wishful steel staff to fight with the long spear, Yutong's eyes almost fell out. He was not fighting with one person. It was simply fighting with 3 people. Is this still a foundation establishment cultivator? Yutong almost groaned like everyone else and secretly smiled bitterly. But it was also because of this question that Yutong's eyes suddenly lit up as if he had thought of something. However, at this moment, he heard Xiao Hua's long roar and his figure skyrocketed. The wishful steel staff crossed through the air and smashed down like a mountain. It hit the 3 long spears at once. The 3 long spears flashed violently as if they were about to collapse. Explode! Yutong hurriedly made a secret gesture in his hand. Rumble! The 3 sounds turned into a loud bang, and the strong impact enveloped Xiao Hua. In an instant, Xiao Hua was flipped over in midair. Xiao Hua's reaction was beyond Yutong's expectations. Xiao Hua's figure was almost like a floating leaf in the wind. Although he was a little out of control at first, he instantly regained his balance. However, when Yutong saw the direction Xiao Hua was flipped in, the expression on his face changed slightly, because Xiao Hua fell near the yin-yang sword gourd that Yutong had previously raised in midair. How dare you? Yutong was a little panicked. He was almost in a hurry to make a sword gesture, as if he wanted to take back the yin-yang sword gourd. Ha ha ha! This thing is kindly accepted by this young master. Although Xiao Hua had not yet approached the sword gourd, he waved his hand and used the heaven and earth technique to cover the sword gourd that was shaking in midair and had not been taken back by Yutong. Yutong tried his best to take it back, but Xiao Hua had already arrived. A strong confining force covered the sword gourd, and the connection between Yutong and the sword gourd disappeared. You. Yutong gritted his teeth, but Xiao Hua said with a smile, "Many thanks." But when he wrapped his mind and wanted to take the sword gourd into his space, an incomparable shock came from the sword gourd. A sharpness that was 100 times sharper than a flying sword flew out from the sword gourd's mouth and locked Xiao Hua's mind in an instant. Xiao Hua was so scared that his face turned ashen. He hurriedly withdrew his mind, but an extremely dim green-red color rushed out from the sword gourd. It was like the green-red sword light from before, and it pierced towards Xiao Hua's face. With a sharp sound, Xiao Hua's Taoist robe was shattered by this green-red color and turned into flying butterflies. Pooh. With another sharp sound, the green-red sword light pierced Xiao Hua's palm that was covering the sword gourd. With a slight turn, it passed through his palm. Xiao Hua's body had been tempered thousands of times, and ordinary magic tools could not compare to it. Unexpectedly, it was easily pierced by this green-red color. The pain that he had not felt for a long time came, and Xiao Hua could not help but cry out. However, just as he cried out, the green-red color arrived at his face. Pooh! Xiao Hua did not have time to think and spat out a wisp of spirit fire. The scarlet-red color immediately flashed, and in an instant, it turned into a wisp and burned towards the green-red color. Ha 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 ha! Yu Tong laughed loudly in the distance, and there was no longer the panic from before. You think this young master did not guard against this move of yours? You took this young master's ancestral magic tool, and you want to take this young master's sword gourd. You are really too greedy. This is soaring scarlet fire? How could this item appear in Dawn Rain Continent? However, just as Yu Tong was shocked, another change suddenly occurred. The green-red light that was about to be burned by the soaring scarlet fire suddenly turned back and almost instantly fell into the sword gourd. Looking at the sword gourd again, it was the 2 drops of blood that had dripped from Xiao Hua's hand that had just been pierced. At this moment, those drops of blood had merged into the sword gourd, and a layer of light gold was born from the blood drops. On the sword gourd, a layer of dark green mixed with the silver-white color appeared and rolled towards the golden color. What is going on now? Just as this thought appeared in Yu Tong's mind, he saw that at the bottom of the sword gourd, a layer of light gold rushed out, and like Xiao Hua's drop of blood, it attacked the dark green and the silver-white color. Yu Tong suddenly remembered, this sword gourd seemed to be Xiao Hua's from the beginning. Xiao Hua saw the green-red light shrink into the sword gourd. How could he not know that he had secretly done something to this sword gourd? The true essence in his meridians immediately rushed out, and the refined spell smashed towards the sword gourd with full force. You dare! Seeing the golden light on the sword gourd, Yu Tong was even more furious. As his figure flew, he slapped his hand, and the pressure of a late gold core stage immediately pressed down on Xiao Hua. Bitter. In fact, Xiao Hua was most afraid of this pressure. Without the support of the Phoenix celestial body, he was definitely not the opponent of Yu Tong's pressure. Seeing the pressure coming, the true essence in his body began to stagnate. Xiao Hua clenched his teeth and used one hand to control the sword gourd, and the other to put away the wishful staff. He struggled to take out his broken nascent soul hand. Woo! As soon as the talisman flew out of the space, it immediately let out a whimper, and the surrounding spiritual energy swarmed in like a hurricane. You want to use a talisman in my great array? You are simply dreaming. Yu Tong's words were accompanied by pressure, and it was truly majestic. Yu Tong's eyes flashed with a strange brilliance, and a strong, old divine sense swept out from between his eyebrows, covering the space around the talisman. The divine sense was like an iron wall, and it suddenly sealed the space. The golden spiritual energy could not penetrate at all. Xiao Hua's nascent soul hand talisman had just absorbed 20% of the spiritual energy, and it had not yet transformed into a palm. It flashed a few more times, and slowly fell down, once again returning to a broken talisman. I don't know if this talisman can be used again. The divine sense cut off the spiritual energy source of the talisman, and then it contracted again, tightly wrapping around Xiao Hua. Moreover, under the pressure, Xiao Hua's whole body was imprisoned, and the true essence in his meridians was quickly condensing, and he could not use any of his magic power. Xiao Hua tried his best to use the fire control technique to control the spirit fire, but the spirit fire was unable to compare to this spirit fire. It was even to the extent that because he didn't have any magic energy to activate it, Xiao Hua was unable to execute the universe in the sleeve technique, and the sword gourd was about to escape his control again. -10. Chapter 26:56. What should I do? Xiao Hua's mind turned sharply. He wanted to take out the wishful steel staff to see if he could defeat this pressure. However, he was firmly suppressed by the spiritual sense and pressure. It was very obvious that Yutong's spiritual sense was not an ordinary cultivator. He must also have some kind of secret technique. Damn it! Today, this young master has really met his nemesis. Xiaohua, who was trapped in a hopeless situation, suddenly became clear. This guy just said something about the flying sword shadow transformation technique. He even said something about towering scarlet fire, and he even said how could Dawn Rain Continent have such a thing? Could it be that this guy? Moreover, he still has something important to do. What is it? Alas, now that things have come to this young master, is it still useful to think about these things? Xiaohua's whole body was suppressed. Not only was his body unable to move, even his meridians could not operate the dragon transformation art. He could not use the Deva body bestowment technique. Even the innate primordial water controlled by the Buddha's Sarira and the flying sword's execution dream and mountain splitter stopped. In an instant, it seemed that everything around Xiaohua was stagnant. Everything stopped. Everything was quiet. However, in the moment when everything stopped, an extremely mysterious fluctuation came from Xiaohua's lower dantian, between the male and female inner cores. Between the two thunder cores was a looming shadow. At this time, with the emergence of the fluctuation, it shrank extremely quickly. After shrinking to the limit, it suddenly collapsed. However, right after it collapsed, a powerful suction force suddenly appeared from the point of collapse. This suction force first grabbed the two thunder cores. However, the thunder cores were originally revolving around this point. When they were pulled near the point, they could no longer be absorbed. The thunder from the two thunder cores struck this invisible point. Kacha, a light purple thing, was born from the point of collapse. The suction force went past the thunder cores and very naturally sucked towards the meridians connected to the lower dantian. This suction force was so powerful and mysterious that it contained the power of the heavenly Tao. How could Yutong's divine sense and pressure contend against it? The true essence in the meridians instantly flowed and rushed towards the light purple point in the lower dantian, core condensation. Xiaohua sensed the changes in the true essence within his body and suddenly came to a realization. He had been looking for an opportunity to condense the core, but he had no clue. In Jinxing's experience, she had mentioned the stagnation of the true yuan. However, the stagnation of the true yuan only occurred after the core was condensed. As for the core, there were different theories. When it came to Xiaohua, all of his cultivation methods had to stop, and all of his Zhen yuan had to stagnate. In this stillness, he had to create something out of nothing to truly condense his Dan. If someone else were to say this, how could Xiaohua believe it? His dragon transformation art, his heavenly man-body empowerment technique, and his bone tempering technique were all in operation at all times. How could he possibly stop? It was only when facing a powerful enemy like Yutong that he was able to condense his core in a situation even more desperate than a desperate situation, right? Oh? This guy is actually condensing his core at this time? Yutong couldn't sense the changes in Xiaohua's body, but when his pressure and divine sense were defeated, he naturally thought of it. Too bad you picked the wrong place. This was the Buddhist Gold Great Array, and you have a late gold core stage opponent in front of you. Yutong sneered. Even when he was pregnant, the confinement force could not compare to this, right? At this point, how could he dare to stay here any longer? Glancing at the blade gourd that was overflowing with golden light and silvery white color, he tried to sense it but didn't find any special reaction. Immediately, the silvery white brilliance around his body flourished. The real tiger Dharma body roared and immediately disappeared in midair. Where do you think you're going? Xiaohua naturally took advantage of the other's weakness to take his life. How could he let Yutong escape? Not bothering to take the Qinli pill, the Buddha's Sarira urged the innate true water to rush towards Yutong. However, in his divine sense, Yutong had already disappeared. Wherever the true water passed, there was no trace of Yutong. That Yutong was also amazing. Using the metal escape technique, he left the Buddhist Gold Great Array in a moment. When he sensed the location of Xiaohua's divine sense, He even ignored the Buddhist gold great array and used the metal escape technique to escape with the help of the sword mound's golden nature spiritual energy. After traveling for over 100 miles, Yutong finally revealed himself with a panicked expression on his face. He sensed his divine sense and looked behind him. Powerful hurricanes had been stirred in the air, and at the center of these hurricanes was a tiny virtual spot. As these hurricanes grew stronger, the dot gradually revealed a sparkling silver-white light. As soon as this light dot appeared, it immediately condensed and enlarged, becoming the size of a grain of rice in a moment. Yutong's eyes narrowed, closely staring at these floating crystals. He knew that this was the celestial phenomenon of Xiaohua's advancement. However, when the crystal grew bigger and bigger, growing to the size of a thumb, it did not stop. -10. Chapter 26:57. The entire sky was filled with this crystal. The crystal grew to the size of a fist. Even the fist-sized crystal was still surrounded by a huge whirlpool, and the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth was constantly gathering in the whirlpool. The crystal was still growing, and large silver-white crystals gradually condensed, floating in the sky above the sword tomb. The crystals were multi-edged and looked extremely beautiful. At this time, Yutong's expression was even more shocked. However, this large, silver-white crystal did not stop condensing and spreading, and it was still extremely stable as it extended into the distance. Which master is this? It's actually... Before he could say actually, he heard a kacha sound of thunder. In the sky more than 100 li above the sword tomb, heavenly lightning flashed that had never appeared before. This is lightning tribulation? Seeing the golden heavenly lightning in the sky, which was completely different from what he usually saw, Yutong's expression changed. It seems to be. It's a demonic beast's third gold tribulation? Damn it, this Feng is actually a demonic beast in human form. He even cultivated to the nascent soul stage. Yutong's eyes flashed with understanding, and his body trembled. How could he dare to stay for even half a moment longer? His body swayed, and he fled towards where he went. However, the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth around him was completely condensed, and for a moment, there really was not enough spiritual energy for him to use the gold escape technique. Yutong could only use the flying technique in a panic, and flew out a full 200 li before that sparkling and translucent silver-white crystal gradually disappeared. This kind of advancement power, other than the nascent soul stage, what else could it be? However, he still had some doubts in his heart. First of all, this was extremely likely to be a demonic beast in human form. The nascent soul stage's power was shocking, but it seemed to be different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Especially, that pressure. Why was it the same as a golden core stage? In fact, the nascent soul stage did not even appear. Of course, these doubts flashed past. After all, Feng Ying was a demonic beast in human form, and it was probably different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Secondly, within 100 li, it was Xiaohua's divine sense. Why? Xiaohua's method did not chase out? Even if this was the key to conceiving a nascent soul, it was not too difficult to take advantage of the confinement of the heavenly Tao to kill him. Of course, in the end, these doubts turned into joy for Yutong. If it weren't for these mistakes, would he have been able to escape with his life? Actually, it wasn't that Xiaohua didn't want to kill Yutong. After all, Yutong knew his bottom line. He didn't want this person to live on the Dawn Rain continent. However, just as Xiaohua wanted to use the restriction to advance, a tearing pain suddenly appeared in his lower dantian. It was as if his entire dantian was being torn apart. Xiaohua turned pale with fright and hurriedly split his divine sense into a strand of inner vision. When Xiaohua's divine sense sank into his lower dantian, he was so scared that 2 of his 3 souls left his body. He didn't know what to do. How could he still care about killing Yutong? Northeast of where Xiaohua and Ningdan were, LV Ruochang couldn't restrain her ecstasy. She looked at the other illusory swordsmen who were also surprised. She didn't hide her joy and said loudly, "Fellow swordsmen, the heavens didn't disappoint our brave warriors. Now, it's finally our turn to reap the fruits of victory. Let's go." After saying that, LV Ruochang took the lead and flew into the distance. Junior sister LV Ruoling was naturally happy as well. She glanced at the people beside her and shouted as she flew. Although the Dao sect's cultivators have already caught up and are about to fall into Junior sister's hands, we've lost too many disciples. However, we have lost too many disciples. There are only 70,000 disciples here. Moreover, we are all injured. We may not be able to fight against the cultivators. In your earlier arrangements, I wonder if we've also made arrangements? Don't worry, Senior Sister Ruo Ling, LV Ruochang said proudly. Although I've placed you and me in the formation earlier, I've also placed the Skyscraper Sword Sect, the High Wind Sword Sect, and even Valley Master Chi Peng of the Swarm of Makuz Valley. However, the battle situation has changed, and I've already made some arrangements. Although the power of the sword formation won't be as great as imagined, I guarantee that even without you and me, none of the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect's cultivators will be able to escape from the Great Square Sword formation. Hehe. Zhu Qingya also flew over and said with a smile, "I don't wish to kill all of these cultivators. I only wish to kill most of them and avenge sword friend Song Yuan." Also, sword friend LV Mu Ting also suggested, "I don't know how powerful the Great Square Sword formation is, but I feel that it's better to leave a barely discernible way out. Otherwise, if the Dao sect's cultivators go all out and fight with their lives on the line, I'm afraid that we'll suffer even more losses." LV Ruochang flew on her sword in the air. Her thin lips curled slightly as she sneered, "Sword friend Mu is right, but how many of my sword domain's warriors have been killed by the cultivators? I wish I could stab them to death one by one. Moreover, I've put in so much effort to set up the Great Square Sword formation in order to capture all of them in one fell swoop. I'm afraid that it'll be difficult to show mercy now." "Sword friend Mu didn't want you to show mercy," Ruoling said with a smile. "She merely saw the Dao sect's cultivators' weakness in setting up the formation and warned you not to kill them all. She wanted to prevent the Dao sect's cultivators from doing anything desperate." Hehe, I understand. LV Ruochang was very respectful towards Ruoling and said with a smile, "How could there be any weakness in the Great Square Sword formation? There's no way out. If the cultivators have any tricks up their sleeves, they can use them all. I'll take them all on." Seeing that LV Ruochang was so confident, no one was willing to say anything else. Their thoughts were the same as LV Ruochang's. They wished for the cultivators to all die. If they could kill 10,000, they definitely wouldn't stop at 9,999. After flying for half a meal, a swordsman wearing a pitch-black sword robe suddenly appeared in the air. The pouring rain seemed to directly rush into the swordsman's body, but also seemed to fall from the swordsman's sword formation. In short, it made people feel that this person was just an illusion. Sword friendy? LV Ruochang seemed to be unable to recognize this swordsman and asked tentatively, "Sword friend LV." The swordsman's sword robe was very strange. It hid his head and face, and even the people's divine senses couldn't penetrate it. That person heard LV Ruochang's question and replied, "I've been waiting here for a long time." "Thank you, sword friend Yi." LV Ruochang was very respectful towards this swordsman. He cupped his hands and said, "After this battle, I'll definitely fulfill my promise to sword friend Yi." I hope so." Swordsman Yi wasn't respectful because of LV Ruochang's respect. He just waved his hand and said casually. LV Ruochang didn't mind and asked again, "Sword friend Ye's matter, how are the arrangements?" "That's why I came to see you." That swordsman didn't answer directly. "I don't know if the matter you promised me. Can I take action now?" "Good." LV Ruochang nodded. "According to our previous agreement, sword friend, you can take action when you see my signal. It's a deal." As Swordsman Yi spoke, his figure actually dissipated. It was as if he was washed away by the rain and disappeared. "Sword friend LV. This person." Ruoling was very surprised as she watched Swordsman Yi disappear and asked softly. However, LV Ruochang didn't answer. Instead, He smiled slightly. That smile was filled with mystery. Everyone flew forward again. After half a meal's time, a figure flew over from afar and landed in front of everyone. It was an old man with a sharp mouth. Everyone was familiar with this old man. It was Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect. "Greetings, sword friend LV." Qing Feng cupped his hands and said as he looked around. "Greetings, sword friend Qing Feng." LV Ruochang faced Qing Feng and clearly wasn't as respectful as he was towards swordsman Yi. He said indifferently, "Have you arranged the array that I instructed you to do?" "I'll let sword friend LV and the other sword friends know." Qing Feng had a bitter expression on his face. It was unknown if it was his original expression or if it was something he couldn't say. He said, "This sword has followed sword friend LV's arrangements completely. Everything is in place." "Good. After this battle, your Quilted Mountain sect will have done a great service." LV Ruochang nodded. "Senior brother Tsang Yuan." Qing Feng clearly didn't discover Tsang Yuan's whereabouts and could only ask. "Alas, sword friend Tsang Yuan died in the Dao sect's array." LV Ruochang sighed and said, "You set up the spirit-devouring array and kill as many cultivators as you can to avenge sword friend Tsang Yuan?" "Yes, this old man understands." Qing Feng nodded sadly. He cupped his hands and flew up again. That hunchback of his became even hunchier. Spirit-devouring array? Mu Ting's eyes turned rapidly. She had heard that the spirit-devouring array needed to be set up and that the spirit-devouring bugs used in this array had to go through many twists and turns because of the terrifying phoenix. However, she didn't expect that this array had already been set up by Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect. Just as she was about to ask, LV Ruochang and Ruoling flew up again. Mu Ting turned her head and looked behind her. The brilliance of the Dao sect cultivators' Dharma treasures soared into the sky and almost dyed the night sky behind her. She didn't dare to stay any longer and hurriedly chased after them. Then, two more swordsmen came to greet them. One was by Tianming of the Three Sword sect, and the other was Xujia of the Kuan Sword sect. They were both second-grade illusory swords. When they saw LV Ruochang, the first thing he said was, "Have you finished setting up the sword array?" The two of them said the same thing. "We've been waiting for a long time." When Ruoling and the others saw Qing Feng of the Quilted Mountain sect, they were familiar with him. However, when they saw the Three Swords sect and the Kuan Sword sect that didn't reveal themselves in the sword battle, they suddenly realized that these second-rate sword sects had been sent here by LV Ruochang to set up the array. It was no wonder that LV Ruochang was so depressed when she was trapped in the 10-direction annihilation array. LV Ruochang still had many other arrangements in the sword tomb. -10. Chapter 26:58. However, Zhu Qingye immediately had a trace of doubt. He was not the first batch of disciples sent out by the Bright Sword sect. He was appointed after Zhong Haoshuan of the Bright Sword sect was killed by Xiao Hua. After he came to the battlefield, although he had heard about the giants and dwarves participating in the battle, he did not see much of it. Even his friend, Ji Minka of the Motyan Sword sect, was nowhere to be seen. However, if Ji Minka was also setting up a formation in the sword tomb, why would these grade 2 illusory swordsmen come out to greet them? Why would Ji Minka, a grade 3 illusory swordsman, avoid meeting them? At this time, LV Ruochang also sent away Xiujia of the Kunjian sect and said, "Fellow swordsmen, 5 miles from here, there is a hill full of blooming purple jasmine flowers. Let's restrain our disciples and gather there." After saying that, he did not say another word. His figure turned into a sword and headed to the side. Although Zhu Qingye and the others were somewhat confused, they knew that this was a crucial moment. They all rushed to the sky and ordered their disciples to contact the disciples of their respective sword sects to gather in front of them. Just as LV Ruochang said, in the night rain, a hill with a radius of 1,000 feet was just 5 miles away. This was really a hill. It was less than 3 feet above the ground, and it was covered with purple jasmine flowers. In the pitch-black night, the rain was getting heavier. The large purple jasmine flowers had their buds lowered. Many of the purple jasmine flowers had withered. Pieces of purple color stuck to the ground, or flowed down the hill with the flow of water, rushing to the flat ground. When everyone arrived, LV Ruochang was already standing on the top of the hill. He raised his eyes and looked at the place where the cultivators came from. His eyes were burning with passion. The disciples of the Black Phoenix Sword sect had already lined up neatly and gathered on one side of the hill. Although these disciples had a trace of a smile on their faces, looking at the broken sword equipment and the few thousand disciples, no one would be happy. Ruoling and the others flew to the top of the hill. The disciples of their respective sects also scattered around the hill in an orderly manner. Disciples, do you know where this place is? LV Ruochang looked at Ruoling and the others, then raised his head and shouted to the 70,000 disciples below the hill. The entire area below the hill was completely silent. Only the sound of raindrops could be heard. Even Ruoling and the others were at a loss in their hearts. Not to mention that it was a rainy night. Even if it was a sunny day, who would know what kind of ruins this huge sword tomb spanned for thousands of miles? Of course, everyone knew that there must be a story behind this hill, and it must be where the sword cultivator had suffered a crushing defeat. But sword cultivators had suffered crushing defeats so many times. Who would know which one it was? However, LV Ruochang didn't speak immediately when no one spoke. Instead, her bright and spirited eyes scanned the swordsmen one by one. That aggressive gaze made every swordsman lower their heads in shame. After half a cup of tea's time, the sound of Dao sect cultivators flying through the air could be heard in the distance. LV Ruochang then said angrily, "It's not that I want to blame everyone here today, but the ancestors of my sword domain have shed their blood in the sword domain. Who knows how many people have been buried? Their hope of defeating the Dao sect had yet to be fulfilled. We may not be talented. We may not have the hot-bloodedness of these ancestors. We may not have the cultivation of these seniors. But we cannot lack the spirit of the sword domain seniors to pass down the torch. We cannot lack the determination to carve this humiliation into our hearts and our lofty bones. Our seniors of the sword domain have suffered defeat after defeat. They have used their unyielding spirit as a seed to plant in their hearts, in the hearts of all the warriors of the sword domain. We have all grown up listening to the deeds of our seniors of the sword domain. Every one of us has the shadow of a senior in our hearts." LV Ruochang spoke passionately. "We all want to be like the heroes in our hearts whose names resound throughout the sword domain. However, this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we cannot forget the humiliation that the Dao sect has inflicted on us for the past 10,000 years, or even 100,000 years. This humiliation can only be washed away with the blood and lives of the Dao sect cultivators. Look beneath your feet. This is an ordinary high slope." LV Ruochang pointed with his finger, his face filled with respect. That year, a famous sword sect in the sword domain, under the leadership of 2 sword transformation seniors, fought a decisive battle with the 3 Dao sect sects in the sword tomb. That sect fought until not a single disciple was left, and they dragged the other 3 sects to their deaths in the sword tomb. The 2 sword transformation seniors of that sword sect gave up on the chance to escape and were killed by 3 nascent soul cultivators from the 3 sects. Why did they do this? It was so that the sword domain's 16 sword sects would not be discovered by the Dao sect cultivators, so that the plan of the sword domain seniors could be carried out safely. However, during that great battle, the sword formation was discovered by the Dao sect cultivators in the end. In the end, they were unable to surround the cultivators, and in the end, they did not obtain victory in the battle. LV Ruochang's tone was somewhat sorrowful. Of course, in the end, this sword sect that was destroyed by the 3 Dao sects did not receive the glory that they deserved. Furthermore, after that great battle, this sword sect disappeared without a trace in the sword domain and never appeared again. Oh, so that's how it is. The group of swordsmen were all enlightened. However, since it was a sword sect that had been destroyed long ago, and it was not an extremely prominent sword sect, how would they know? What this sword wants to talk about is this nameless sword sect. There are so many of them in my sword domain, and there are also many swordsmen who silently died on the battlefield. LV Ruochang continued, no matter when we are, no matter if we are defeated or victorious, we cannot forget these nameless swordsmen and nameless sects. LV Jianyu. Ruoling suddenly came to a realization and cried out involuntarily, "You're talking about the Flying Dragon Sword Sect? This place is what the Tao Sect swordsmen are called, the Dragon Punishing Slope?" That's right. I didn't expect senior sister Ruoling to know about this. LV Ruochang's eyes revealed a trace of surprise. She did not expect Ruoling to know about the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. Sigh, I'm ashamed to say this. Ruoling's face was somewhat miserable. This sword only happened to look through my sect's sword scroll when I was about to come to the battle and accidentally came across it. It's already good that senior sister can see it. LV Ruochang comforted. In today's sword domain, who would still remember the Flying Dragon Sword Sect? Yes, that's right. Ruoling understood LV Ruochang's meaning and said loudly, "Disciples of the sword domain, about 8,000 years ago, there was a mysterious sword sect in my sword domain, and it was the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. This sword sect's secret Flying Dragon Sword technique. Almost every disciple could comprehend the Flying Dragon Sword intent. It was very popular in the sword domain, and for hundreds of years, there was not a single sword sect in the sword domain that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Flying Dragon Sword Sect." Oh, the crowd of swordsmen was completely in an uproar. Almost all of their eyes flashed with disbelief. They seemed to have never heard of such a powerful sword sect. It's just as LV Jianyu said. During that great battle, the Flying Dragon Sword Sect contributed greatly to my sword domain and killed countless cultivators, including nascent soul cultivators. Ruoling continued. At the same time, at the end of the great battle, the commander of my sword domain decided to set up a sword formation in the sword tomb, preparing to lure the Tao sect cultivators into the sword formation to surround and annihilate them. However, the news was leaked, and the Tao sect cultivators rushed into the sword tomb ahead of time. Seeing that the swordsmen had yet to finish setting up the formation, the disciples of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect volunteered to stop the Tao sect cultivators here, and buy time for the warriors of my sword domain to set up the formation. In the end, even when the last person from the Flying Dragon Sword Sect died, the sword formation was still not set up. We sword cultivators still lost that great battle. LV Ruochang continued, and in order to commemorate that great victory, the Tao sect cultivators named this place Dragon Slaying Slope. That's right, the contribution of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect was great. Ruoling sighed again. Their elites were all killed in the great battle, and the disciples left in the sword domain were not outstanding. And then, seeing that Ruoling did not continue, LV Ruochang sneered. And then the Flying Dragon Sword Sect was swallowed up by some sword sects and disappeared from the sword domain. Indeed, Ruoling said in a low voice. When this sword saw this, my heart was also filled with emotions. This kind of sword sect, we, the various sects of the sword domain, should properly protect them. LV Jianyu, Zhu Qingye frowned. The conditions of my sword domain are terrible. If there is no competition, no fighting, how can warriors be produced? The matter of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect is definitely not intentional, sword friend mentioning it now. Hee, what Zhu Jianyu said is reasonable. LV Ruochang laughed. The survival of the fittest, this is the axiom of my sword domain. This sword once again said that this time, I do not have any intention of blaming any swordsman or any sword sect. This sword only wants to let you sword friends know that my sword domain has countless such swordsmen, countless such sword sects. We cannot forget them at any time. As long as we have their spirit, with their actions, why should we worry about not being able to take down the Tao sect? Why should we worry about not being able to defeat the sword tomb? Yes, we understand. All the swordsmen said in unison. Good. LV Ruochang pointed again and said, since the beginning of the Tao Cultivator War, this sword has been planning to set up a killing sword formation at the Dragon Slaying Slope where the Flying Dragon Sword Sect swordsmen died, and kill the hundreds of thousands of Tao sect cultivators one by one. Now, this sword's wish is finally half completed. Those stupid Jurassic beast cultivators have indeed caught up. Right now, we are at the center of the great square sword formation that this sword has set up. And within a radius of 10 miles is the first great formation of the great square sword formation, the Yin-Yang sword formation. Then, LV Ruochang pointed outside and said, Outside the yin-yang sword formation is the second great formation, the five-element splitting-edge sword formation. Further outside is the third great formation, the spirit-devouring formation. As for the outermost layer, it is a mysterious formation. This sword has not thought of a good name for it, but I believe that after today's killing, this great formation will have an extremely resounding name tomorrow. -10. Chapter 26:59. Good. Mu Ting and the others were delighted when they heard this and immediately cheered. My sword domain's several sword sects have already set up this great square sword formation. We're just waiting for the stupid cultivators to take the bait. Lu Ruochang clapped his hands and took out several sword slips and said, "Disciples of the various sword sects, you've already worked hard. There's no need to attack in the sword formation. The sword sect disciples who set up the formation will activate the sword formation according to the previous practice. However, I'd like to ask all of you, are you willing to sit there and watch the other sword sect disciples kill the enemy? Are you willing to be hunted down by the cultivators? Don't you want to take revenge for the disciples who died on the battlefield? Can you be like the Flying Dragon Sword sect 10,000 years ago, exhausting your last bit of sword origin and killing the last cultivator? We're willing to assist the disciples who set up the formation." All of the swordsmen's blood boiled as they said in unison, "For the great victory of my sword domain, for the extermination of the Tao sect's cultivators, even if I have to crush all of your bones, even if I have to destroy all of your sword sects, can you be like the Flying Dragon Sword sect with no regrets?" Lu Ruochang shouted again, "We're willing to sacrifice ourselves for the victory of sword domain, with no regrets." All of the swordsmen shouted without hesitation. "Good." Lu Ruochang clapped his hands and several sword slips flew into the hands of Ruoling, Mu Ting, and the other grade 3 illusory swordsmen. He said, "Sword friends, please lead the sword sect disciples to the 3 sword formations and kill the cultivators together with the other sword sect disciples." "Yes, we'll obey." Zhu Qingye and the others received the sword slips and bowed. Then, they used their divine sense to look at them and ordered their disciples to lead the various sword sects in different directions. Naturally, Ruoling and the others were a little puzzled by Lu Ruochang's arrangement at Dragon-Slaying Slope. They were even curious why Lu Ruochang suddenly brought forward the Flying Dragon Sword sect and asked all the disciples to imitate the Flying Dragon Sword sect and have no regrets even if the sect was destroyed. However, the situation was urgent at this time, and it was the key for the swordsmen to turn the tables. They only thought that LV Ruochang wanted to cover up his previous mistakes in command, so they didn't ask much. They flew everywhere according to LV Ruochang's instructions. Waiting until there were no more disciples in front of the dragon-slaying slope, LV Ruochang let out a long sigh. He raised his head and looked at the night sky. Although the night sky was pitch black, there were already traces of white light in the east. Obviously, dawn was coming. The rain is very heavy. It can wash away the blood and tears of the sword tomb. The wind is very strong. It can blow away the smoke of the sword tomb. However, although a long time has passed, it can't erase the hatred in the heart. Can the courage in the heart of a swordsman be washed away by time? LV Ruochang muttered to himself. Her voice was not loud and had long been drowned out by the sound of the rain. However, even though the sound of the rain was loud, it could not drown out the sound of hundreds of thousands of Tao sect cultivators chasing after her. Hearing the sound getting closer and closer, LV Ruochang's mouth revealed a trace of coldness. The sword aura around her body gradually appeared, and the flying sword under her feet also glowed. She flew up from the dragon-slaying slope and flew towards the other side of the yin-yang sword formation, and in front of her, the disciples of the Black Phoenix sword sect who had already flown away revealed their sword splendor. This sword splendor faintly shone in the night sky, as if some lanterns were floating in the air, pointing out the direction in the night. "They're quick. Chase after them. Kill all the swordsmen." After flying for a while, LV Ruochang stopped in the air and looked back. It seemed that there were arrogant figures of cultivators. LV Ruochang coldly looked at them. She clapped her hand, and a green flying sword appeared in her hand. The green sword aura on the flying sword reflected on her face, revealing a trace of malevolence within the snow-white skin. Whoosh! LV Ruochang activated the sword origin. The flying sword faced the curtain of rain and rushed into the night sky. When it reached a high altitude, it let out a clear cry. It was actually a huge phoenix. This phoenix cry was extremely loud and clear, and it resounded in the surrounding dozens of miles. Looking at LV Ruochang, who was quietly standing on the dragon-slaying slope, her body glowed with sword light and she flew into the distance. On the dragon-slaying slope, other than the bright night rain, there were only the ruined purple jasmine flowers. It seemed that no one had ever stayed here. In the east, the sky was gradually turning white. It seemed that even the dawn was unwilling to be left out. It wanted to see this lively sword battle. The jade-green phoenix that charged into the sky naturally attracted the attention of hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators. Hang Jie's heart sank and his divine sense hurriedly swept over. However, just like before, his divine sense was only able to sweep out a few hundred feet before it was restricted and couldn't reach far. Quick! Heng Zhao almost did not hesitate and turned to a disciple and shouted, "Turn around and go back." Before he could finish his sentence, he hurriedly looked to the side again. That disciple was a little confused and did not know what to do. He asked curiously, "Uncle Heng Ming, why are you turning around? Aren't you chasing after the sword cultivator?" Previously, when Li Zongbao was in the 10-direction annihilation spell, he did not activate the spell like the other disciples of the utmost happiness faction. Instead, he sat beside the spell and meditated. At this moment, when he was chasing after the sword cultivator, he accompanied Heng Zhao. When he heard Heng Zhao's order, he said calmly, "Master, don't worry. I will go ahead and check if I have fallen into the sword cultivator's ambush." Go and come back quickly." Heng Zhao was a little absent-minded. He waved his hand and flew up towards the huge, flashing phoenix in front of him. "Yes." Li Zongbao bowed and turned to instruct the disciples on his left and right. "Leave 30% of the disciples behind. Stay where you are and do not follow the other disciples." The disciple who did not know what to do earlier had a stern look on his face. He hurriedly bowed in agreement and hurriedly passed down the order. Li Zongbao stretched out his hand and held the immortal piercing whip in his hand. He turned around and flew into the air, against the flow of hundreds of thousands of cultivators, towards the back. LV Ruochang's phoenix flying sword condensed in the sky above the dragon-slaying slope and did not dissipate for a long time. In this slightly bright night sky, it was so dazzling. This phoenix attracted the attention of hundreds of thousands of cultivators. The Qi refining and foundation establishment disciples did not dare to overtake it. Without the orders of the Golden Core stage masters, they still pushed forward in the formation. However, it was obvious that their flying speed was much slower. They were preparing to deal with the change. Fellow cultivator Heng Ming, Desun flew over first and said anxiously, there were still some traces of those sword cultivators who fled earlier. But in this moment, I did not even see a bit of sword light. Could it be? Fellow cultivator Desun, if you want to say that the slightest sound and the crane is scared out of its wits, it should be the sword cultivators. What does it have to do with us cultivators? Do you think that we have fallen into the ambush of the sword cultivators? Ji Hong snorted disdainfully. Wang Yi looked at the sword light in the sky in the distance. He bit his lips and said coldly, when did these barbaric sword cultivators learn to mislead soldiers? Could it be that they think that a signal like a message can scare us? -10. Chapter 2660. Kill. Xiong Huasong said without hesitation, I don't believe that a sword cultivator can silently set up another sword formation outside my 10-direction annihilation formation. If that's the case, wouldn't it be the biggest joke in the world? Yes, Xiong Huasong didn't dare to believe it. Although this place was only 100 miles away from the 10-direction annihilation formation, if a sword cultivator made any movements here and set up a sword formation that could take down hundreds of thousands of cultivators, how could he not know? That's right, this is the empty city plan. In an instant, Heng Heng also made a decision and waved his hand. Disciples, kill, kill. When the disciples around Hung Hung heard the order, they all shouted in unison. This sound spread out and spread in waves. Close to 100,000 cultivators were shouting loudly, and the momentum was very threatening. Then, some of the hesitant cultivators once again increased their flying speed. However, even when they flew to the front of the dragon punishing slope and pushed under the phoenix sword intent, they still didn't see any traces of the swordsman. Moreover, in the distance, it was also pitch black, without a trace of sword brilliance. In addition, at this moment, it was the darkness before dawn. The previous trace of light had already disappeared, and the entire world was exceptionally dark. However, the torrential rain from before gradually lessened at this moment, and the rain began to fall intermittently. Hung Hung and the other golden core cultivators were also cautious at this time. First, they stopped the group of cultivators from advancing and sent 100 or so Foundation Establishment late-stage disciples to fly forward to explore the path. Then, Gao Wei, Shtong Huasong, and the others waved their hands and took out their magic treasures. Their figures flew straight into the sky, as if they wanted to explore the meaning of this huge phoenix. Hung Hung and the others looked at the figures of Xiong Huasong and the others while releasing their divine senses to carefully explore this extremely ordinary-looking slope. Boom! A loud sound rang out. Before Gao Wei and Shtong Huasong could fly close to this huge phoenix, the phoenix let out a deafening sound and turned into thousands of green sword lights, flying in all directions, clearly illuminating the surroundings several miles. Hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples formed a black mass within a radius of a couple of miles. They formed a spindle shape. Most of them were gathered near the dragon punishing slope. There were quite a number of them extending forward in front of them. Behind them, there were over 10,000 people who remained at the same spot. They appeared to be very cautious. The green sword brilliance only shone for an instant, and in the next moment, the entire dragon-slaying slope fell into darkness. Fellow Taoist Hung Ming, De Sun frowned and said, "This matter is rather strange. We need to be careful. In this old man's opinion, why don't you stop while you're ahead?" Fellow Taoist De Sun. Ji Hong was a little unhappy. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly heard a rumbling sound within 10 li of the dragon punishing slope. The ground shook violently. Not good. Flying high in the sky, Gao Wei, who had just landed, immediately panicked and said anxiously, "Let's go quickly. I'm afraid we've fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush." "Shut up." When Hung Ming heard this, he roared angrily, "Disciples, listen to my command. Form the usual defensive formation." Yes, when the group of disciples first heard Gao Wei's words, they were very flustered and almost wanted to scatter and flee. However, when they heard Hung Ming's words, they suppressed the fear in their hearts. Each small team formed a formation, each sect formed a formation, and in a moment everything stabilized. Gao Wei was humiliated in front of everyone. His face was burning, but he did not even have the courage to glare at Hung Ming, because his shout just now was indeed too abrupt. Rumble. The earth's shaking did not stop. Instead, wave after wave, it became more and more intense. Even at the place where the thousands of green sword brilliance disappeared, faint sword brilliance gradually emerged from the darkness and flashed from the horizon. This. Although Shtong Huasong did not land, his voice could be heard. He was almost in disbelief and shock. How is this possible? We've actually fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush? Xiong Huasong was not the only one who did not dare to believe it. All the golden core cultivators in the meeting hall did not dare to believe it. The changes in this battle were too unpredictable. Even in their wildest dreams, they did not expect that the swordsmen who were about to be killed by them would actually set up such a huge sword formation when they were in a desperate situation. They had opened their pockets and were waiting for them to come in. Moreover, what puzzled the hundreds of thousands of cultivators was that they had really come in. This must be a trick to mislead the troops. Ji Hong shouted without hesitation. Lu Ruochong has less than 70,000 swordsmen under his command. How can they surround hundreds of thousands of cultivators? How can they set up such a huge sword formation? However, at this point, This female cultivator, who was incomparably touched by Qian Mo's words, suddenly had a brilliant flash of light in her mind, like all the other golden core cultivators. Jihong was dumbfounded. While Hung Lu was shocked, he coldly glanced at Jihong and said indifferently, "Daoist Jihong, did you see that? I have already said that we shouldn't pursue a cornered enemy, but for the sake of Daoist Qian Mo's blood feud, we still chased after them." Jihong heard the reproach in Hung Lu's tone. How could she not understand what he meant? Just as she was about to retort, she heard Hung Ju's tone change. She wasn't a fool, so she gritted her teeth and said, "That's right. This old one also knows not to pursue a cornered enemy." At that time, if we had stopped, even if these sword cultivators had laid down this sword array, they definitely wouldn't have been able to succeed. But if we didn't chase after them, how could we face our own conscience? How could we face Qianmo, Li Chengxiu, and the other Taoists who died? When Hung Lu heard this, his heart was slightly relieved. However, Desun's face was heavy as he said, "Fellow Taoists, don't blame yourselves. Previously, I felt that the end of this battle was a little strange and couldn't figure out where the sword cultivators had gone. It was impossible that there were only the hundreds of thousands of disciples, led by LV Ruochong and the others. Now, their true purpose has been revealed. A portion of their disciples were setting up the sword formation in the sword tomb. They had set up an ambush here, and were waiting to lure us in. From the looks of it, even if we don't take the bait this time, they will still have other ways to lure us in." Gao Wei hurriedly said, "This plan, I'm afraid that it had already started when we agreed on the 10-direction annihilation grand formation?" "That's right," Xiong Huasong nodded and said, "and this old man is sure that this sword formation must have been set before the 10-direction annihilation grand formation. Otherwise, this old man would have known about it." Hung Lu nodded. Daoist Xiong's words are reasonable. Moreover, Daoist Xiong's grand formation did not attract the attention of the sword cultivators. It is indeed Daoist Xiong's great merit. "It's nothing." Xiong Huasong was secretly proud, and at the same time, he said humbly, "Daoist Qian Mo's thoughts are actually the same as the sword cultivators. He is even more powerful." "That's right. That's why we have to avenge him at all costs." Hung Lu hurriedly added, "I'm afraid this is not the time to shirk responsibility." Li Jijie of the Changbai sect saw that the many golden core cultivators were actually not in a hurry to set up the formation and instead talked about the reason for the ambush. He couldn't help but say coldly, "Wait until we kill our way out of the sword formation, then it won't be too late to talk about other things." Hung Lu's face was slightly embarrassed, but he didn't care about Li Jijie's cold words. If he didn't explain clearly the responsibility of chasing and attacking, everyone would come to an agreement in their hearts. Even if he could lead the disciples of the Utopia faction to break out of the encirclement safely, he wouldn't feel at ease. Humph, the sword cultivators only have 70,000 people. They fell into our grand formation first and lost more than half of them. This so-called ambush and sword formation, I'm afraid it won't be intact." Jihong spoke again. "We only need to set up the formation to deal with them. Do you think we're afraid of them?" Xiang Ming of the Huanhua sect stood far away and didn't get too close. At this moment, he also opened his mouth and said, "That's right. Our Dao sect cultivators have more than 100,000 people. Just like the sword cultivators breaking through the formation, they are charging in the same direction. How can they not break out of the sword formation?" At this moment, a figure flew over and stopped in front of Hung Lu. It was Li Zongbao, who had just flown back to check out the situation. "Zongbao, what's the situation?" Hung Lu raised his eyebrows and asked anxiously, "Reporting to Master, senior uncles and senior uncles." Li Zongbao bowed and said, "The large group of people who came to kill the sword cultivators has been divided into two parts by the sword formation. The sword formation is green and red in color and is gradually taking shape. Golden chi and hurricanes are rising above the sword formation. I tried to charge through the sword light, but the sword chi inside is very strange. Every time, a green and red sword light attacked me, as if they were cooperating with each other. It's very powerful. I can't break out of the encirclement, so I don't know the situation of the other group of disciples." Hung Lu nodded. "This sound is also the sound of the sword formation?" "Yes." Li Zongbao answered. The green and red sword light was born from the ground of the sword tomb. It violently surged like a drum, and the ground within 100 feet collapsed. Many disciples tried to charge out before the collapse occurred, but they were all killed by the green and red sword light. Moreover, the collapse didn't stop when I came back. It seems that the sword formation's power is not small. Set up the formation. When Hong Lu heard that even Li Zongbao couldn't break through, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. However, he snorted coldly. Insignificant skill. You're really picking up the wisdom of others. We'll return now. Let's see how this sword formation can stop us. Good. How could Desun and the others not agree? They all clapped and praised. Hundreds of thousands of cultivators quickly arranged themselves into a formation in the shape of a sharp knife. However, hundreds of thousands of cultivators arranged themselves into a formation in the time it took to brew a cup of tea. During this time, the situation at the dragon-slaying slope changed again. The rumbling sound of the earthquake gradually approached from afar. Under the shaking of the ground, the purple jasmine flowers that couldn't be washed away by the heavy rain were all shaken off, leaving only the smooth purple flower stems. Looking at the green and red sword light that Li Zongbao mentioned, it soared into the sky from the ground in the distance, like a huge bonfire, surrounding hundreds of thousands of cultivators in an area of more than 10 miles. See, Hong Lu and the others' divine senses couldn't go very far, but they could see it clearly with their naked eyes. They couldn't help but gasp. Setting up a sword formation in such a large area, not to mention its power, the scale was probably much larger than the 10-direction annihilation formation. -10. Chapter 2661. Hong Hong even looked at Xiong Huasong. After all, this sword formation was so close to the magic formation. How could Xiong Huasong not notice it? Xiong Huasong's face was also extremely ugly. This was really a slap to his face. Although the sword catacomb was incomparably dangerous and one's divine sense couldn't travel very far, but this was still a huge sword formation. It was right next to his magic formation. How could he not notice it? Could it be? Xiong Huasong suddenly had an idea in his mind. However, just as he was about to speak, there was a continuous rumbling sound. The vibration surrounding the dragon-slaying slope intensified and spread extremely quickly. It had already rushed to the feet of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators and reached the vicinity of the dragon-slaying slope. All disciples, pay attention, Hung Ming said loudly. Activate your magic power and advance towards where you came from. Boom. A huge sword cry directly suppressed Hong Heng's voice. At the place where the dragon-slaying slope was located, the ground of about 10 zhong had completely collapsed. Two sword lights that were thicker than pillars rushed into the sky. That biting cold sword chi and soaring sword light immediately illuminated the area within dozens of li in a green and red color. These two sword lights, one crimson red and the other azure, were like pillars that reached the sky, piercing straight into the sky. Ha ha ha. Welcome, welcome. From within the sword pillar, a loud and clear voice sounded. When the cultivators raised their heads to look, they saw that from within the crimson sword pillar, a red-faced, muscular middle-aged swordsman wearing a red sword robe appeared, holding a similarly crimson flying sword in his hand. Who are you? Hong Hong looked at this unfamiliar swordsman and coldly said, Ha ha ha. That swordsman was still laughing. He took a step forward and flew out from the sword pillar, saying, This sword is the Supreme Harmony Sword Zong Yang Juding. A nobody. Looking at this second-grade illusory swordsman, Li Jijia coldly said, Hee, if senior brother Yang is a nobody, then there is no need to talk about this sword. A laughter that sounded like a silver bell came from the azure sword formation. Following the flickering of a sword light, another petite and beautiful female swordsman wearing an azure sword formation flew out from the sword pillar. Junior sister Xiao. The corners of Yang Juding's mouth curled into a smile as he said, The cultivators of the Dao sect have always been arrogant, and they look down on us swordsmen, not to mention us second-rate sword sects in the sword domain. However, they don't know any better, so we have to be polite. Junior sister, If you don't tell us your name, wouldn't they have died an unjust death when we kill them? Senior Marshal Brother Yang's words make sense. The female swordsman chuckled and said, I am Shujia of the Kuan sword sect. I'll be waiting for you. Don't forget my name when you reach the underworld. How dare you? Li Jijia scolded. You're just two grade 2 illusory swordsmen, yet you dare to brag here. Senior Marshal Brother, let me take their heads. The 4 cultivators beside Li Jijia looked at each other and said in unison, Okay. Li Jijia nodded slightly when he saw that they were 4 disciples of the early stage of the Golden Core realm. When the 4 disciples saw that Li Jijia was doing the same, they waved their hands, and the flying swords in their hands flashed with brilliance. They flew up and flew towards Yang Jioding and Xiujia, who were leaning against the green and red sword pillars. The 4 of them had just flown a few feet when the brilliance around them flashed. 4 rays of sword light flashed with 4 colors. The sword chi rushed out of the flying swords and slightly intertwined in the air. It seemed that there was a strange connection between the 4 rays of sword light. The sword light began to rotate. When the 4 saw this, they shouted in unison, Quick! Immediately after, the flying swords in their hands shot out. Each hand formed a sword seal, and the 4 flying swords suddenly accelerated like shooting stars piercing the sun. The 4 flying swords gave birth to 4 different forces. These forces were not only extremely sharp, but they also cooperated with each other, trapping Yang Jioding and Xiujia in an area of dozens of feet. As expected of the disciples of the Changbai sect, they actually used the Dharma array technique on their flying swords. Yang Jioding sneered. However, Dharma arrays are all Dharma arrays. The flying swords inside are just Dharma artifacts. How can they compare to the sword array of us swordsmen? As he spoke, Yang Jioding waved his hand very casually. It was like a fountain sprinkling a few drops of spring water. Several crimson sword lights pierced towards the 4 flying swords. However, when the crimson sword lights pierced a few feet in front of the flying swords, the 4 flying swords suddenly trembled and suddenly changed directions, stabbing towards Xiujia. Xiujia was originally smiling as he watched Yang Jioding deal with the 4 flying swords. However, when the 4 flying swords changed directions, the crimson sword beams missed. Xiujia couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Seeing the 4 flying swords close in on him, he also pointed with his finger. Several azure sword beams flew out from the azure sword pillar to meet the 4 flying swords. Under the control of the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators, the 4 flying swords turned into 4 streams of light and fiercely pierced towards the green sword lights that looked like thin threads. Just as the azure sword light was about to collide with the 4 streaks of light, the several azure sword lights twirled slightly and turned into a dozen streaks of light. At the same time, the crimson sword light that had missed its target suddenly changed direction and pierced towards the 4 streaks of light at a speed several hundred times faster than before. Crack, 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 crack. For crisp sounds could be heard as dozens of green-red sword silks circled around the 4 flying swords. These 4 flying swords of extraordinary quality were immediately sliced in half. Not good. The 4 flying swords were easily destroyed, and the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators' minds were seriously injured. They didn't dare to attack anymore and turned around to fly back. Where do you think you're going? Yang Jioding shouted and pointed with his hand. A dozen rays of crimson sword lights fell from the sky and pierced towards the 4. Xiujia also controlled the green sword lights. A dozen rays of light circled around each other and pierced towards the 4 people like lightning. The 4 people were shocked and their souls almost flew out of their bodies. Humph! Li Jijia snorted coldly in midair. The flying sword in his hand flew out and turned into a golden light. It rushed towards the green and red sword lights like a coiling dragon. Good timing, seeing Li Jijia's sword light surpassed the 4 people and was about to hit the green and red sword light. Another low voice came from the sword pillar. A short old man with a face full of wrinkles flew out from the sword pillar. This old man's body flashed with the same green and red brilliance. He waved his hand and punched the flying sword. The old man appeared so suddenly that Li Jijia didn't have time to react. With a pong sound, Li Jijia's flying sword was hit by the old man's fist. The flying sword emitted a GA sound and flew down diagonally. Not good. When Li Jijia's flying sword was hit, his mind was also shaken. However, when he controlled the flying sword, his gaze fell on the dozen rays of light piercing towards him. Sure enough, without waiting for the dozen or so cyan-red sword lights to descend, the four of them clapped their hands together and four magic treasures flew out from their storage pouches. They were actually four identical shield-type defensive magic treasures. The four defensive magic treasures suddenly enlarged under the urging of the four people's magic power. They were now several feet in size and emitted a green-colored brilliance. This brilliance was extremely bright and protected the four people's bodies tightly. Moreover, it was very obvious that the brilliance of these four magic treasures lingered around each other, and the fluctuations of spiritual power were also linked. It was just like they were used to cooperating. However, when the dozen rays of light fell on the green brilliance of the magic treasures, they immediately intertwined. The green brilliance also shook violently and fought with the sword light. However, what shocked the four people was that this sword light was extremely different from the sword light they had encountered before. In the fight, it actually avoided the important part and focused on the trivial. It was like a strange tentacle that wandered around, as if it was looking for the weakness of the magic treasures. Hee. While the four people activated their magic treasures to defend, they quickly descended. However, at this moment, they heard Xiao Jie's sneer in their ears. The four people felt a chill in their hearts. Sure enough, following the sneer, a thin green sword light pierced into the gap between the two magic treasures that appeared in an instant. At the same time, another thin crimson sword radiance appeared along with the azure sword radiance in an even more bizarre manner. Fight! The heart of the golden core disciple closest to the two sword lights tightened. With a flick of his hand, several rays of spiritual power appeared and a series of seals appeared to block the sword lights. Puff, puff, puff. The green and red sword lights crisscrossed in the air and streaked across like lightning. The defensive seals that the golden core disciple used were all pierced by the sword lights. Not good. When the disciple saw this, he was even more shocked. The spiritual power in his body surged and golden light shined around him as if he was activating a magic treasure to protect his body. Li Jijia also hurriedly pointed with his finger again. The flying sword that was knocked away paused for a moment before slashing toward the dozen rays of green and red sword lights. The two rays of green and red sword lights that penetrated the magic treasure were especially fast. The moment the magic treasure appeared, the sword light landed on the disciple's body. It was like a silk thread that wrapped around the disciple's neck. The sword light wrapped around the early-stage golden core cultivator's neck. The protective magic treasure glowed with an extremely resplendent brilliance, and this brilliance flashed violently. However, in front of Li Jijia and the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators, the golden light protecting the golden core cultivator was instantly annihilated. The golden core cultivator's head flew up and a pillar of blood spurted high into the air. At this time, Li Jijia's sword light had just touched the dozen rays of green and red sword light. Ha ha ha, this time, the weapon cultivator who suddenly attacked didn't attack. He just stood in the air and laughed. The dozen rays of sword light seemed to have intelligence. The moment they touched Li Jijia's sword light, they immediately dodged and flew into the green and red sword pillar and disappeared. Li Jijia's flying sword actually hit nothing. Damn it! When Li Jijia saw that one of his Changbai sect's golden core disciples had been killed and his attack had failed, he was shocked and enraged. Since Li Jijia and the other golden core cultivators were shocked, how could the hundreds of thousands of foundation establishment and chi refinement cultivators not be scared? -10. Chapter 2662. Idiot. Seeing that Li Jijia was about to go into battle, Hong Feng couldn't help but curse in his heart. He flew out and said, "Fellow Taoist Li, look at the big picture. Don't mess up your formation. There are tens of thousands of sword lights, hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators. Although you and I are golden core cultivators, it won't be easy to deal with them." When Li Jijia heard this, he snorted coldly and stopped in the air. His eyes were fixed on the corpse of that disciple, and the other 3 disciples who had landed beside him with shocked expressions. Where did this sword cultivator come from? How dare he launch a sneak attack without announcing his name? Hung Feng looked at the old man with a strange glow around him and knew that this old man was a weapon cultivator. As expected, the old man showed a trace of arrogance and said, "I am Ming Changsho from the Flying Feather sect." "You're also a nobody," Hung Feng said indifferently. "Although I'm a nobody, I can do things that will shock the world." Meng Changsho's expression changed slightly and he sneered. "After this battle, my name will definitely resound throughout the 3 cultivation countries." "Ha ha ha, with just the sword formation?" Hung Feng laughed loudly and then looked at the east where the sky had already turned white amidst the drizzling rain. He said, "Did the sun rise from the west today?" Formations have always been the ultimate technique that our Dao sect cultivators rely on. When did it become a weapon that sword cultivators use to attack our Dao sect? Caw! Another clear cry was heard. This cry sounded like that of a bird, yet it wasn't. It was extremely ear-piercing. Many aura-refining disciples who heard this cry felt as if their hearts were being pricked by needles, causing them to lose their footing. An old man wearing a strange gray robe flew out from the other side of the sword pillar. He had a flat round head, large eyes, and 2 of his eyes emitting a faint grayish-yellow light. Looking at this old man's slightly pointed nose and long eyelashes, as well as the fine and thick feathers on his face, all the cultivators knew that this old man must be a bird cultivator. So, these nondescript heretical cultivators have all come to the sword catacomb to set up formations. Hung Feng seemed to have understood something. "I am Liang of the Kunmu Valley. I have been ordered by Lu Ruochang to set up this great sword formation. I have been waiting for you for a long time." The old man's voice was sharp, and he quickly finished speaking in one breath. He spoke so quickly that Hung Ming was stunned. It took him several breaths to react. Hung Zhao rolled his eyes and raised his voice. "Where is Lu Ruochang? Is she hiding just like that? Does she not dare to meet her old friend?" "Humph, what old friend? We are enemies. LV Jianyu is the best strategist among the warriors of the sword domain. As long as she commands us, we will naturally fight to the death. Why do we need her to come and see you?" Liang said in a clear voice. "Heh." Hung laughed coldly. "She's probably scared by this old man's array, isn't she? You've become a coward." At this point, Hung felt that it was inappropriate. If this was the 3 kingdoms of cultivation, all the cultivators would be furious at the mention of a coward. However, there was no lack of beast cultivators in the Han kingdom. The old man in front of him looked like an owl or a parrot. Who would care about being a coward? Sure enough, Liang did not care. He said coldly, "All this nonsense is useless. We have set up a sword formation here in the sword catacomb. You and I will meet in the sword formation. You only need to break the sword formation and LV Jianyu will definitely face you." As he spoke, Li Ying's gray sword robes flapped as if he was about to fly away. "Liang, I am Xiong Huasong of the Black Heaven sect." Xiong Huasong would not let go of the opportunity to ask. He hurriedly stepped forward and asked, "Let me ask you, what is the name of your sword formation?" "You want to know the name of this sword formation?" Liang stopped. A strange light flashed in his grayish-yellow eyes. "That's right." Xiong Huasong nodded. "What is the name of the great formation that your Dao sect set up earlier?" Liang asked hesitantly. "That great formation is my Black Heaven sect's 10-direction annihilation formation." Xiong Huasong replied without hesitation. Li Ying's eyelids twitched rapidly. Then, he replied, "Heh, I'm not afraid to tell you. This is the Yin-Yang sword formation. If you have any tricks up your sleeves, feel free to use them. I'd like to see how you'll break the formation." "When was this sword formation set up?" Xiong Huasong quickly asked. When was your 10-direction annihilation formation set up?" Li Ying clearly wanted to know when the Dao sect set up the formation in the sword catacomb. Xiong Huasong hesitated for a moment. He glanced at Hung and said, "It was only a few months ago." "A few months ago?" Li Ying was extremely surprised. They had been setting up the formation for several years under LV Ruochang's orders and had finally completed it. They were just waiting for LV Ruochang and the rest to lure the Dao sect cultivators into the formation. However, a 10-direction annihilation formation had suddenly appeared beside the four-corner sword formation. To be honest, Liang and the rest were even more surprised than Xiong Huasong and the rest. They wanted to know when the Dao sect cultivators had set up the Great Formation. Of course, Liang and the rest also understood that the sword cultivators had been suppressing the Dao sect's attacks. The battle lines had already penetrated deep into the country of Shi and the country of Lian. They had never expected the Dao sect cultivators to set up a formation in the sword catacomb. Therefore, the defense in the sword catacomb was very lax. Furthermore, the sword catacomb's terrain was very special. They could not possibly detect every single movement in the sword catacomb. They could not possibly detect any strange movements in the sword catacomb. After all, strange movements were normal in the sword catacomb. If it was normal, it would be abnormal. Whose idea was it? Liang asked faster than frying beans. Qian. Xiong Huasong replied without hesitation. Hong Ming asked anxiously, when did you set up the sword formation? It won't be too late to ask after you answer this question. Humph. We have been setting up the formation here for more than 8 years under LV Jianyo's orders. Liang snorted coldly. 8 years. Hong Ming looked at Xiong Huasong. Xiong Huasong's eyes clearly revealed a sense of relief. Forget it. Hong Ming sighed. Now it seems that our previous victories in the Spirit Stone Mine and other places were all part of your plan? You wanted to lure us into the ambush in the Sword Catacomb? We are not very clear about the battle on the front lines. Liang did not hide anything and said proudly, those were all done by LV Ruochong and LV Jianyu. We were only waiting here for you to fall into the trap and kill you all. As the saying goes, the onlooker sees more clearly. Although Hong Ming and the others were involved in the planning of the great battle of Dao cultivators, when they turned their heads to look at the situation of the battle, they were like onlookers again. Many details were clear at a glance and were far more clear than when they were sitting in the meeting hall of Sky Patrol City talking nonsense. Only when they heard that the Yin-Yang sword formation had been set up for more than 8 years did Hong Ming and the others truly realize that the sword cultivators of the Han Kingdom were not as weak as they thought. They had planned for a long time. At the same time, Hong Ming and the others were extremely emotional as they thought of two people, Tu Hong and Qian Mo. Both of them had already fallen and were not regarded as cultivators in their eyes. If it wasn't for Tu Hong's arrogant wish to create another Golden Spring Mountain in the Sword Tomb, and Qian Mo's close relationship with Tu Hong due to D.Y. Qiming's matter, he would have selflessly mentioned it in the meeting hall and had his own ideas. If it wasn't for this, the Dao sect cultivators would never have thought of setting up a formation in the Sword Tomb, let alone a 10-direction annihilation formation. However, the cultivators' indifferent actions actually brought them a pleasant surprise. If not for Hong Ming's greed and Ji Hong's arrogance in killing the sword cultivators, the Dao sect would have almost won this time, and this great battle of Dao cultivators would almost be over. But the Dao of Heaven was clear. Because of Hong Ming and the others' greed, they had fallen into the sword formation that LV Ruochong had painstakingly set up for 8 years. After hearing Li Ying's words, Hong Ming and the others already knew that this yin-yang sword formation was not something that the sword formations they had encountered previously could compare to. Indeed, with a long cry from Li Ying, the green and red sword pillars shone brightly and covered the figures of Shou Jie, Yang Jioding, Meng Changshou, and the others. Within the large formation, within a radius of 10 miles, where the earth had trembled previously, there were now flashing sword lights. These sword lights were only green and red, and they were like bamboo shoots after the rain, shooting out from the ground. Disciples. Hong Ming hurriedly ordered, "Kill! Kill!" The disciples heard the order and shouted in unison. That shout reverberated throughout the large formation, and the fear from before seemed to have dissipated significantly. At the same time as Hong Ming gave the order, the green and red sword pillars flashed. The green and red sword lights split into thousands of sword lights and sprayed in all directions like a skyrocketing fountain. The sword lights that drilled out from the ground also let out sword cries and rushed into the air. They formed a joint attack with the sword lights of the sword pillars and pierced towards the cultivators from above and below. Not only that, The sword lights that Li Zongbao had seen previously absorbed the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth and the sword intents of many remnant swords from dozens of miles away, attacking the hundreds of thousands of cultivators trapped in the center from all directions. Xiong Huasong saw the power of the yin-yang sword formation and could not help but gasp. He thought to himself, this sword formation is not much inferior to the metal destruction formation. Although the sword lights had yet to reach the cultivators, the wind and clouds in the entire large formation changed drastically. Sword chi swept out like a huge beast's mouth, swallowing everyone. The green and red sword lights were the fangs of the ferocious beast. Although the thousands of green and red sword lights could not be compared to the yin-yang sword lights released by second-grade illusory swordsmen like Xiujie and Yang Jiuding, their power was definitely not to be underestimated. Attack, in the blink of an eye, the yin-yang sword lights pierced towards the cultivators. How could the formation that the cultivators had formed dare to be careless? They hurriedly channeled their magic power and took out their magic weapons and treasures. Tens, hundreds, and even thousands of treasures flashed and smashed towards the green and red sword lights. Rumble within the sword formation. The first rumble was heard. Then, the rumbles continued to explode, one after another, each louder than the last. The dozens of disciples of the Black Heaven sect formed a strange formation. After they took out their magic weapons, flames soared into the sky and hundreds of huge fireballs hit the sword light that was coming from above. -10. Chapter 26:63. Pa, pa, pa. A series of explosions rang out in the air like firecrackers lit by children. The moment the 100 or so fireballs came into contact with the sword light, they were all sliced apart by the green and red sword light. They couldn't stop the sword light from penetrating deeper. However, at the same time that the fireballs exploded, the brilliance of the sword light also dimmed, and the sword chi also weakened. A series of blood-curdling screams came from the Clear Leaf sect disciples. The green and red sword light had broken through the formation of more than 10 chi refinement disciples. The green and red sword light cut through the necks, waists, and even legs of these disciples as if they were weeding grass. Whenever the green and red sword light flashed past the bodies of these disciples, their bodies would be sliced open by the sword light. As blood spurted out, their corpses also fell from the sky. Illusion? Right, illusion. The mid-foundation establishment disciple saw that he couldn't block the red sword light that was slashing between his brows and felt his soul leave his body. However, when the sword light fell, he didn't sense any abnormalities. He immediately understood that the countless green and red sword lights that covered an area of several kilometers weren't all sword lights. Some of them were illusions of the sword formation. However, just as this disciple shouted, 2 more sword lights flew over in pairs. The disciple hastily activated his magic treasure to block them. However, a thin crack appeared on his magic treasure from the sword light. It was obviously not an illusion. Thus, the disciple became extremely depressed. That's right, even if you know that there are illusions in the sword light. So what? Can you not use your magic power to block each sword light? Moreover, even if you used all your strength to resist, how many yin-yang sword lights can you resist? The yin-yang sword formation quickly closed up, and the green and red sword lights wantonly crisscrossed. These sword lights were like scythes, reaping the lives of chi refinement cultivators one after another. Their magic treasures and talismans couldn't block these incomparably sharp sword lights at all. These green and red sword lights were also incomparably cruel. Most of them cut through the cultivators' necks. Apart from a small number of cultivators who could barely dodge and scream before they died, the rest of the cultivators had their heads chopped off without a sound. Blood soared into the sky. Thus, not long after, nearly 20% of the chi refinement disciples among the hundreds of thousands of cultivators lost their lives. The pungent smell of blood permeated the entire formation. The drizzling rain couldn't wash away this vicious stench of blood at all. Moreover, countless drops of blood flowed into the ground of the sword tomb along with the rain. The purple jasmine flowers that were washed by the rain earlier became even more beautiful. Sure enough, a A sword formation couldn't be compared to a formation. In fact, the two were completely different. The formation used the formation to condense the dermic powers of the disciples to form a powerful attack. This attack focused on the overall power of the formation. On the other hand, a sword formation combined the sword lights of a group of swordsmen. They interacted and strengthened each other, forming an even more powerful sword light and sword chi. This sword formation emphasized a kind of naked slaughter. Attack. Dozens of people from the Huanhua sect formed a formation. A group of Foundation Establishment and Qi Refinement disciples activated their magic treasures, and a huge, thick, green-colored tree, about 10 zhang long, formed in the air with a rumble. The surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth spun violently and was sucked into the green-colored tree formed by many magic treasures. Woo! The green tree flashed around the group of disciples, blocking the 10 or so sword lights of yin and yang. Under their combined efforts, the huge green tree slowly smashed into the ground. Boom! Hundreds of green and red sword lights rushed out from the ground and pierced into the green tree. While the runes on the surface of the green tree were corroded, they also blocked the sword lights. Under the heavy pressure and confinement, the sword lights curved. As the green tree fell to the ground, a huge roar erupted. At the same time, the cries of swords rang out endlessly. When the greenwood splendor rushed into the ground, circles of green splendor violently overflowed. It actually struck the swords until they dimmed, and many of them even disappeared. Seeing that the attack was effective, the disciples of the Huanhua sect almost cheered in unison. However, just as they were about to activate their mana again with a smile on their faces, more than 10 rays of green-red sword light flew towards them from the side. They slanted and were about to stab into the formation they had formed. In this yin and yang sword formation, the green and red yin and yang sword lights were like fish in water. Every time 2 green and red sword lights interacted, their speed was extremely fast. Moreover, there were many sword lights crisscrossing each other. Who would be able to distinguish them in time? By the time the crowd could distinguish the 10 or so sword lights, they were already in front of them. The Foundation Establishment disciples in the formation were better off. They hurriedly activated the flying spell and tried their best to dodge. However, the aura refining disciples had just activated their vital chi. Now that they hurriedly activated their flying talismans, they were not as agile as the Foundation Establishment disciples. There was not much space for them to dodge. As the 10 or so sword lights flashed, another 10 or so lives were lost. The 10 or so aura refining disciples were scared out of their wits. Their faces were ashen, and the joy from before was still frozen on their faces. Their eyes flashed with infinite terror. Caw! At this critical moment, the crisp cry of a phoenix sounded from the left side of the disciples. Then, a thin, azure-blue screen quickly spread out from the side of the disciples. A voice that was very similar to the cry of a phoenix said crisply, "Don't look at this primordial water. Focus on defeating the enemy." The dozens of sword lights rushed into the thin blue screen, but they only managed to penetrate an inch deep before they were disintegrated by the dust like rays of light that shot into a polygonal crystal. All the dust disappeared. "Thank you, Senior Sister Hongxia." The 10 or so Foundation Establishment and aura refining disciples were overjoyed when they heard this voice. They obediently moved their divine senses and gazes away from the thin screen. With a cheer, they formed a formation again and slowly activated their magic power. Looking at the side of the crowd, Fairy Hongxia was wearing a crimson-red robe. She released the phoenix celestial body that was 10 feet in size. The ice phoenix was controlling the innate primordial water to protect the crowd. Xiao Hua defeated Ji Yi in the 7 Extremes Ridge as a nameless person and forced Ruoxi to retreat with hundreds of thousands of swordsmen. The thunder-controlling sect, Huanhua sect, and other Dao sect disciples occupied the 7 Extremes Ridge's Spirit Stone Mine. Then, under the command of the Sky Patrol City's conference hall, Fairy Hongxia and the others attacked the swordsmen who were not too far away under Ming Yu's leadership. Then, when the swordsmen were defeated, they chased them to the Sword Tomb. As for the Imperial Thunder Sect, because Qin Shang had seen Wu Ming's so-called Imperial Thundershock with his own eyes, He was sent back to the Imperial Thunder Sect for questioning. The disciples of the Imperial Thunder Sect did not stop at the Seven Extremes Mountains. Instead, they were sent to the Clear Cave. In the Sword Tomb, the Huanhua sect was in charge of the Ice Destruction Array. Because Fairy Hongxia had the Ice Phoenix celestial body and her physique was of the ice element, she was more effective in the array than the ordinary Foundation Establishment disciples. Even the Golden Core cultivator Mingyu stayed by Fairy Hongxia's side to protect her. Of course, Fairy Hongxia did not disappoint. She played a great role in killing the Huanjun sect. When the sword cultivators broke the formation and retreated in defeat, Fairy Hongxia finally felt relieved. She knew that the battle was over. She had contributed a lot to Huanhua. She was overjoyed. She was thinking about how to tell Mingyu and let Xiaohua accompany her to the ancestral home of the Kai clan. Unfortunately, Fairy Hongxia's joy was only for a moment. Many Huanhua sect disciples flew out of the array and went deep into the sword tomb to chase after the defeated sword cultivators. Fairy Hongxia did not know what others were thinking, but she was extremely unwilling to chase after them. Not to mention the dangers of the sword tomb, the results of the ice destruction array were enough to satisfy her. Moreover, Fairy Hongxia knew the principle of not chasing after a cornered enemy. Unfortunately, Fairy Hongxia was only a disciple in the late Foundation establishment stage. Even Mingyu, who was beside her, did not have the chance to speak. What could she do? When the hundreds of thousands of cultivators entered the yin-yang sword formation, Fairy Hongxia was also burning with anxiety. While she defended against the enemy with Mingyu, her beautiful eyes looked around, desperately trying to find traces of Xiaohua. She knew that in such a dangerous situation, only her lover Xiaohua could protect her, right? Speaking of Xiaohua, Fairy Hongxia felt an indescribable sweetness in her heart. Besides this sweetness, there was also a trace of bitterness. She wanted to see Xiaohua now, but she did not want Xiaohua to appear now. The reason was simple. Ever since the Seven Extremes Mountains, Fairy Hongxia had no news of Xiaohua. She also did not see Li Zongbao and Xiao Mao. However, the tidal beads and connate primordial water that Xiaohua gave her had saved her life many times, ensuring that she would be fine in the battle. As for Fairy Hongxia's magic treasure, Crimson Drill, it had been damaged by Yun Bai in the Seven Extremes Mountains. Although it had recovered a lot after some simple refinement, it was not very useful in this battle. Every time Fairy Hongxia used the connate primordial water, she would think of her lover and her heart would be filled with sweetness. However, ever since the Seven Extremes Mountains battle, Mingyu, who had a good impression of Fairy Hongxia, took care of Fairy Hongxia even more because of Fairy Hongxia's performance. What made Fairy Hongxia unhappy was that this golden core female cultivator, who regarded her as a direct descendant, would occasionally talk to her about the non-existent John Doe. She did not seem to look down on John Doe because of his looks. Instead, her tone was full of admiration. With Fairy Hongxia's intuition as a female cultivator, she could even feel that Mingyu had feelings for John Doe. Of course, although Fairy Hongxia's cultivation and age could not be compared to Mingyu's, she was born in an aristocratic family and had the fate of being together with Xiaohua. She was not inferior to Mingyu in matters of love. She also knew that this was just a feeling that was dispensable. If she did not have the chance to interact with John Doe, this feeling would not be considered a feeling at all. However, if she had the chance to interact with John Doe, this feeling could immediately turn into a web of love. Therefore, Fairy Hongxia did not know whether to laugh or cry. -10. Chapter 2664. As a female cultivator, Fairy Hongxia already had a knot in her heart regarding Xiaohua and Xue Xue. She had never seen Xue Xue, but she had heard Xiaohua mention her before. She had even secretly inquired about her before. However, Xiaohua had already made it clear to her. The intelligent Fairy Hongxia knew that Xiaohua had already made up his mind. She must not be jealous and make Xiaohua unhappy. This would be inappropriate for her, Xiaohua, and even Xue Xue. Secondly, when Xue Xue confessed, she was not by Xiaohua's side. She had not even confessed her love to Xiaohua. From this point of view, Xue Xue's courage to love and hate was much stronger than hers. She could only let Xue Xue take the initiative. Thirdly, Xue Xue was also a disciple of Imperial Thunder sect. Fairy Hong Xia understood the principle of the pavilion closest to the water enjoys moonlight first. This was something she could not achieve. Besides, with Xue Xue by Xiaohua's side, Fairy Hong Xia could rest assured that no other female cultivator would interfere with her relationship with Xiaohua. Fourth, she had the fate of being together with Xiaohua first. Xiaohua had also said clearly that in Xiaohua's heart, she was much more important than Xue Xue. From this point of view, Fairy Hong Xia knew that Xiaohua, who had always valued friendship, would treat her well, even better than Xue Xue. Based on the above thoughts, Fairy Hong Xia could accept this Xue Xue who had an opportunity that she could not have. She had also made up her mind to get along with her in the future. But for this sudden appearance of Mingyu, she definitely felt more pressure than a mountain. This was a golden core cultivator, and Fairy Hong Xia also vaguely knew that Nameless was the first male cultivator that Mingyu, a golden core cultivator, was prepared to accept in her heart. If Mingyu really had the idea of dual cultivation with Nameless, Fairy Hong Xia did not know how to kill this idea. What made Fairy Hong Xia the most bitter was that Mingyu's Nameless was not real. This Nameless was her lover, Xiaohua. What made Fairy Hong Xia feel the most incredulous was that Mingyu, a Jindan stage teacher, would mention her lover in front of her. Every time she talked about John Doe, the shyness and admiration in her eyes were purer than that of a 16-year-old girl. Furthermore, Fairy Hong Xia could only follow Mingyu's thoughts and talk to her intimately. Of course, Fairy Hong Xia would also attack Mingyu from time to time, talking about John Doe's appearance and his short stature. That damned enemy. I don't know where he ran off to. He shouldn't be here. Fairy Hong Xia saw that the interior of the yin-yang sword array was filled with dazzling lights. The sword beams and magic treasures were locked in an intense battle. From time to time, there would be loud explosions. However, she did not see any familiar figure. She could not help but grit her teeth fiercely. Her fine white teeth seemed to have bitten into Xiaohua's chest. Sure enough, right next to her, there was a round disc that looked like a moon. It was Mingyu's magic treasure, Mingyu. At the same time, Mingyu's melancholy voice sounded, "Alas, what a pity. I wonder where senior brother Nameless is. If he was here, he would probably be able to break this array, right? Don't you agree, Martial Niece Hongxia?" Yes, yes. If that old man was here, he would definitely be captured easily. Fairy Hong Xia bit the word old man heavily, just like how she bit Xiaohua fiercely. Mingxiu, be careful, it was just that. Just as Fairy Hong Xia was about to bite off a piece of Xiaohua's flesh, two extremely strange green and red sword beams streaked across the sky. Those who were hit by the sword beams all had their heads separated from their bodies. It was truly powerful. And these two sword beams were sweeping towards Ji Mingxiu, and the rest who were not too far away from Fairy Hong Xia. Fairy Hong Xia's warning was still a little too late. Ji Mingxiu and 3 other Foundation establishment disciples who were on good terms with Fairy Hong Xia had joined forces to deal with the other sword beams. Not to mention that they did not hear Fairy Hong Xia's warning. Even if they did, they would not be able to dodge in time. Fairy Hong Xia did not dare to be careless. Without releasing her Phoenix Dharma body, she activated the tidal bead within her Dharma body. A stream of connate primordial water flew out and turned into a water screen the size of a palm, blocking in front of Ji Mingxiu and the rest. Swoosh, with a soft sound, the 2 sword beams sank into the connate primordial water. But what shocked Fairy Hong Xia was that the 2 sword beams were not disintegrated by the connate primordial water. In fact, the 2 sword beams only changed their direction after entering the connate primordial water. Then, they suddenly pierced towards Fairy Hong Xia. Get out of the way. Mingyu was right beside Fairy Hong Xia. Seeing that the connate primordial water was unable to block the green and red sword beams, she hurriedly shouted. The bright moon that was flying above her head shot out diagonally. The bright moon was like a round disc, emitting a bright moonlight, blocking in front of Fairy Hong Xia. Kacha! With a crisp sound, the green and red sword beams hit the magic treasure, Mingyu. The bright moon flashed, and the 2 sword beams flashed. The light on the bright moon dissipated, and a small crack appeared on the magic treasure. Hiss! Mingyu saw that the magic treasure was damaged, and the two sword beams were gradually disappearing. She could not help but gasp. How? How can these two sword beams be so powerful? Martial Ant Mingyu. Fairy Hong Xia did not have time to thank her. She hurriedly said, "From what I see, the sword beams in this yin-yang sword formation are not the same. These two sword beams are the same as the ones that killed the Changbai sect Golden Core seniors, and the green and red sword beams that we encountered earlier should be from the swordsmen who set up the formation. They are not the same as these two sword beams." Ming Yu's eyes flashed, reflecting the green and red sword beams. She turned to look at the center of the sword formation, at the two green and red sword pillars. She said, "That's right. These two sword pillars are the eye of the sword formation. The green and red sword beams attracted the sword beams of the swordsmen who set up the formation. Maybe there are only two sword beams in the sword pillars, and the rest are illusions. As long as we destroy these two sword pillars, the yin-yang sword formation should be broken. Even if we can't break it, the rest of the green and red sword beams can be dealt with by the formations of the Foundation Establishment and Qi Refining Disciples. It is 100 times stronger than the yin-yang sword light that only Jindan stage seniors can defend against, and the green and red sword light that ordinary swordsmen can defend against. It is even mixed with some illusions, making it impossible to distinguish between reality and illusion." Fairy Hong Xia also came to a realization. "Let's go and report to Senior Xiang Ming." Mingyu looked up and saw Hung Li, Xiang Ming, and the other Golden Core cultivators of the conference hall working together, flying in front of the group of disciples. Hung Li and the rest were not the first to retreat, but they had the same idea as LV Ruochang. First, they worked together at the edge of the yin-yang sword formation to create an opening, allowing the group of Dao sect disciples to escape from the sword formation. Hong Hong and the others activated their own Dharma treasures and flew in front of them. The stormlight green and red sword lights landed on their Dharma treasures, but were unable to cause any ripples. They were all destroyed by the Dharma treasures. Occasionally, the true yin and yang sword lights would hit their Dharma treasures, but they only managed to break a little of the Dharma treasures' defense, which would be repaired by other Dharma treasures moments later. They were far from being able to cause any damage to them. Of course, as Hung Li and the rest flew to the edge of the sword formation, they were also paying attention to the situation within the sword formation. Seeing how bloody the yin-yang sword formation was, Hung Li whispered, "Fellow Taoists, we need to speed up. This yin-yang sword formation is too cruel. The green and red sword beams are split into yin and yang, and the sword qi seems to have some special effect. When the two sword beams combine into one, the power is far greater than two. It is especially useful for destroying the defensive light of our cultivators. Any disciple below mid-foundation establishment stage can't resist at all. At this moment, they can only rely on their combined attacks and formation techniques to fight back. Once they run out of magic power, they won't be able to use the sword formation. Not to mention borrowing the power of the sword formation. Even if a swordsman rushed out and fought with us face to face, we disciples would not be a match for him." Yes, fellow Taoist Hung Ming is right. Li Jijia controlled his flying sword. After clashing with the sword beams of the yin-yang sword formation a few times, he also gained some insight. He replied, "With the sword formation, sword cultivators can defeat many and break this sword formation. Sword cultivators don't have anything to rely on. We can advance or retreat, and we can maintain our victory." Desun's tone was a bit hesitant. He whispered, "I have a bad feeling." "Oh?" Hung Li frowned and asked, "Could it be that fellow Taoist Desun is thinking the same thing as I? Is it the yin-yang sword beam that killed the Changbai sect disciples just now?" Desun didn't answer Hung Li directly. Instead, he asked, "Fellow Taoist Hung Ming, are you saying that the sword beam that even Golden Core cultivators can't resist is placed at the edge of the sword formation to block our way out?" Hung Hung looked above his head and saw the sword lights flying out from the two sword pillars. Like a fountain, they connected with the green-red sword lights dozens of miles away and enveloped him and the others. He nodded and said, "That's right. This is what I'm worried about." Xiujia and the others who set up the formation must have placed extremely powerful flying swords at the edge of the sword formation to prevent us from breaking the formation and returning. I's worry isn't limited to that. Dasun sighed. We saw it just now. Other than the yin-yang sword beam that killed the Changbai sect's golden core cultivators, we haven't seen many sword beams as powerful as this. Most of the flying swords in this sword formation can only kill cultivators below mid-foundation establishment stage. What about cultivators above early foundation establishment stage? Do they rely on those rare yin-yang sword beams? Hiss. Although the group of golden core cultivators failed in their plan, their thoughts were not bad. They immediately sucked in a breath of cold air and almost all understood. Hongming said anxiously, could it be that fellow Taoist Dasun is saying that LV Ruochang has set up other sword formations besides this yin-yang sword formation? This sword formation can kill mid-foundation establishment stage, late foundation establishment stage, and even golden core cultivators? That's right. LV Ruochang and the others have been setting up this sword formation for more than 8 years. If it wasn't for a sword formation that could kill golden core cultivators in the conference hall, would she need to rack her brains? She only needs to fight us in the state of Shi and the state of Lian. Dasun felt that his premonition was right. -10. Chapter 2665. Hung Zhao was even more hesitant and almost stopped. He asked hesitantly, are we not going to break the array? Master. Li Zongbao was not far from Hung Ju. When he saw Hung Ju hesitate, he hurriedly sent a voice transmission. We can't hesitate now. Even if sword cultivators have many tricks up their sleeves, I have to deal with every move that comes my way. Let's break this array first. That's right. Hung Zhao's heart skipped a beat. He cursed himself for being foolish and hurriedly added, even if the sword cultivators have such an arrangement, we have to break this yin-yang sword array first and let the disciples rush out. Good. The group of cultivators saw Hung Zhao's decision and knew that this was the only way, so they all sped up. Zongbao. Hung Zhao's heart was still beating fast. He transmitted his voice in a low voice. I'm not sure what to do now. If you have any ideas, you should have told me earlier. This battle is not only about the victory of our sect, but also the fate of our Utopia faction. I understand. Li Zongbao hurriedly replied. Then he transmitted his voice again also. I have an idea. Say it. Hung Zhao hurriedly asked. If you have any ideas in the future, tell me immediately. Yes. Li Zongbao did not dare to delay and continued. In breaking arrays, the strongest point has always been the flaw. Previously, LV Ruochang used this method to break my golden destruction array. That's right. Hung Zhao was shocked again. He turned his head slightly and looked at the sword pillars that were already far away. He transmitted his voice, Zongbao. You said that these 2 sword pillars are the most powerful part of the yin-yang sword array. Then, they should be the eye of this yin-yang sword array, right? Yes. Li Zongbao replied honestly. What I think is that these sword pillars must be the eye of the array. I'm sure all the golden core stage masters know this too. However, Xiujia and the others used these sword pillars to kill a golden core stage martial uncle at the beginning. This makes people feel that these 2 sword pillars are extremely powerful and not easy to break. Let's look at the edge in the distance. They even knew that we wanted to escape from the sword array, so they might have built the edge of the sword array to be extremely strong. On the other hand, the central sword pillar, the sword chi is scattered around. It might be the weakest part of the sword array. That makes sense. Hung nodded slightly. However, the yin-yang sword light was born from within the sword pillar and scattered from the center to the edges. These 2 sword pillars might not necessarily be the weakest points. They might even be the strongest points. At this moment, a magic treasure in the shape of a full moon was protecting a person. That person then summoned an azure primordial water to protect more than 10 people. They flew to the left of Hung Zhao and the others. The female cultivator who summoned the full moon magic treasure shouted, Senior Martial Brother Xiang Ming, I, Mingyu, have something urgent to report. When Hung Zhao and the others saw the dozen or so people from the Huanhua sect easily escape the attack of the green and red sword light, their eyes were filled with surprise. However, when their gazes landed on the true water, they immediately looked away, afraid that they would fall into the illusion of the true water. Xiangming frowned slightly and said loudly, "Mingyue, what's the matter?" At this moment, Mingyu kept her magic treasure, while Fairy Hongxia used the true water to shield the crowd. Ji Mingxiu and the other disciples of the Huanhua sect appeared in the true water. Mingyu bowed and said, "I'm Kai Hongxia, a foundation establishment disciple of the Huanhua sect. I'm here to report that something is wrong with the sword formation." "What's wrong? Quickly report it." Xiang Ming also had an impression of Fairy Hongxia. However, the situation was urgent. When he saw Fairy Hongxia using the true water to protect the Huanhua sect disciples, his expression softened and he urged. Fairy Hongxia did not dare to delay and hurriedly explained her thoughts. She then added, "I feel that although the yin-yang sword pillar is strong, it must have been created by the sword that set up the formation. However, it is still the eye of the formation and is the key to activating the sword chi of the swordsman. It is definitely not as strong as the surrounding sword chi. On the other hand, the surrounding sword chi must have been activated by Shujia and the other illusory swordsmen to prevent us from breaking out. It must be extremely powerful. Instead of breaking the formation at the edge, why don't we just face the swordsman and directly destroy the sword pillar in the eye of the formation?" "Good." Without waiting for Xiangming to speak, Hung Ming clapped his hands and said, "The Huanhua sect disciple is right. Just now, I's disciple, Li Zongbao, reminded I to break the strongest sword pillar in the sword formation. He did not take the disciples who set up the formation into consideration. What this disciple said is exactly what Li Zongbao said." Hearing this, Xiang Ming's face showed some displeasure. It was obvious that Hung Ming was trying to steal his credit. However, the people around him looked thoughtful. Xiang Ming thought about it and knew that what Hung Ming said was probably true. Li Zongbao might really have the ability to break the formation. "Fellow Taoist Hung Ming, what you said is also the suggestion of my Huanhua sect disciple?" Xiang Ming asked. "That's right." Hung Ming nodded and looked at the crowd. He said, "I was just thinking about how to break this formation. Since the Huanhua sect disciple has made this suggestion, then we will split into two groups. One group will still be led by I to the edge of the sword formation, and the other group will be led by Xiangming to the center of the formation. My disciple, Zongbao, will assist the Golden Core Taoists to break the yin-yang sword pillar. The Huanhua sect disciples will follow me to the edge of the formation. As for who will go to the center of the formation, Xiangming will have to choose for himself." Hearing this, Xiangming looked at Hung Ming helplessly. Actually, everyone knew that although what Fairy Hongxia and Li Zongbao said was reasonable, the two sword pillars had to be broken at the center of the formation. They had just come out from there, and now they had to turn back. If these two people's predictions were right, then so be it. If they were wrong, then they would be walking back into the tiger's den. Whoever Xiangming chose would most likely bring that person back to his death. Xiangming would not cause trouble for himself. He quickly said with a smile, "Hung Ming, you must be joking. You are the one in control of this battle. How can I speak? Although I have to turn back to break the formation because of my disciple's suggestion, I can only choose the person to follow me." Hearing this, Fairy Hongxia suddenly realized that her words had dragged Xiangming into a possible quagmire. She immediately bowed and said, "Uncle Xiang, since I have made such a suggestion, then I must take responsibility. I am willing to accompany you to the center of the sword formation." "Very good." Xiangming nodded slightly. His expression was unreadable. Mingyu also sighed. She did not think too much about it. Seeing Fairy Hongxia's decisive choice, she did not say anything else. She flew to Fairy Hongxia's side and expressed her support for Xiangming. Ji Mingxiu and the other Huanhua sect disciples were all clever people. Knowing that there was no need to hesitate, they immediately moved to Fairy Hongxia's side. "All of you, follow Hung Ming to the edge of the formation." Seeing that his disciples had made such a decision, Xiang Ming was happy. He pointed at the disciples other than Ming Yu and Fairy Hongxia. "Your cultivation is shallow. Even if you go back, you won't be able to help much. Your thoughts?" "I know." "Yes." Ji Mingxiu and the rest did not dare to refute. They flew to Hung Ming's side. Li Zongbao pondered for a moment. Looking at Fairy Hong Xia and Mingyu, he also raised his immortal whip and flew to their left. Ha ha ha, this old man will volunteer. De Sun laughed and waved his hand. A few Taiching sect disciples followed him and flew to Li Zongbao's left. He said, "Fellow Taoist Hung Ming, please don't blame me. That's right. I will also head to the center of the formation." Ji Hung's mind was also racing. Without waiting for Hung Ming to point her out, she flew to Da Sun's side. "Since you want to break the formation and find the weakness of the yin-yang sword formation, how can I be left out?" Xiong Huasong was also confident and flew out with a smile. Following which, a few people flew out without waiting for Hung Ming to point out their names. They were Xuanyan sects Gao Wei and the rest. Great. Hung Ming saw that the number of golden core cultivators who took the initiative to return was not more than half, but it was almost the same. He clapped his hands and laughed. "Everyone is noble and unsullied. I appreciate it. When we break the yin-yang sword formation, it will be time for us to reward you. Fellow Taoists, please." With that, Hung Ming flew out first, leading the rest of the cultivators to the edge of the yin-yang sword formation. Xiang Ming led De Sun and the rest to the center of the formation. After flying for a while, Li Zongbao heard Fairy Hong Xia's voice transmission. "Senior Brother Li, may I ask, where did Xiaohua go?" "Xiaohua's whereabouts? I don't know either." Li Zongbao knew what Fairy Hong Xia was thinking. He frowned slightly and said, "But I know that he is not in this sword tomb, nor is he in this sword formation." Fairy Hong Xia sighed and did not ask any more questions. "Junior sister, Hong Xia." Li Zongbao hesitated for a moment before he sent a voice transmission. If junior brother Xiao is here, even though his cultivation is outstanding, when it comes to truly fighting, he might not be able to accomplish anything. Moreover, this is a sword formation against a magic formation. The effect of a single cultivator is much smaller. It is better that he is not here. Fairy Hong Xia clearly didn't understand the meaning behind Li Zongbao's junior sister Hong Xia, nor did she understand the reason why Xiaohua wasn't here. She just casually responded. Li Zongbao also didn't know Fairy Hong Xia's understanding of Xiaohua, so he didn't say anything more. The green and red sword pillars shot straight up into the sky, then connected with the green and red sword light dozens of miles away, forming the entire yin-yang sword formation. On the sword pillars, Xiao Jia of the Kuan sword sect, Yang Juding of the Supreme Harmony sword sect, Meng Changshou of the Soaring Feather sect, and Li Ying of the Herd of Makaza Valley looked coldly at the bloody massacre in the sword formation, with a hint of excitement in their eyes. Xiao Jia looked at the corpses of the Qi Refinement and Foundation Establishment initial stage disciples within a few miles of the sword pillars. He turned to Yang Juding and said, "Fellow Taoist Yang, it is indeed as Senior Sister Lu said." The cultivators of the Tao sect were already terrified and fled in panic. No one noticed the two yin-yang sword pillars. -10. Chapter 2667. Yes, Senior Sister Lu is the mastermind. Everything is going according to her plan. Yang Juding also nodded. Although there were some deviations when we entered the sword tomb, the flaws do not obscure the beauty. The final outcome is still in her hands. Li Ying frowned slightly and said, "It's a pity that these Tao sect cultivators did not scatter and flee as LVGNU expected. I'm afraid that our yin-yang sword formation will not be able to withstand a full force attack from those Tao sect golden core cultivators." Hee, Yang Juding chuckled and said, "You don't have to worry about that, Li Jianyu. Although the situation of the cultivators retreating is beyond Senior Sister Lu's expectations, she has already made arrangements for such a situation. The sword formation that Junior Sister Xiojia and I have laid down will fight them to the death in the end. All of the sword chi of the yin-yang sword formation will be gathered in one place when it is time to fight. The Tao sect cultivators that have been killed by the yin-yang sword formation will not be able to withstand a single blow from the yin-yang sword formation." "I hope so." Li Ying did not seem to think that the situation was as optimistic as Yang Juding's. He only nodded slightly. Just as he nodded, his yellow eyes flashed slightly as he noticed the abnormality of the yin-yang sword formation. He hurriedly pointed his finger and said, "Not good." The Dao sect cultivators have discovered the secret of the yin-yang sword formation. More than 10 golden core cultivators are leading their disciples over. Oh, it's true. The smile on Yang Juding's face froze. With the help of the sword formation, he could see clearly and cried out involuntarily. Meng Changshuo said leisurely, "There are indeed many hidden dragons and crouching tigers among the Dao sect cultivators. They still managed to discover it in such a short time." So what? Yang Juding refused to admit defeat. The yin-yang sword pillar is activated by the yin-yang sword. Even golden core cultivators will find it difficult to resist. Even if they discover it and come here, they can only temporarily affect the sword formation. When we kill them, senior brother Yang, Shujie reminded him, let's make preparations. Every moment counts. The yin-yang sword formation has already killed tens of thousands of qi refinement and foundation establishment cultivators. We have already completed senior sister Lu's task. Yes. When Yang Juding heard this, his heart skipped a beat. He immediately activated the sword essence in his body as his body emitted a scarlet sword beam. A flying sword that resembled a blazing sun flew out from his body. However, as soon as the flying sword fell into the scarlet sword pillar, all of its sword intent disappeared, and it returned to being a flying sword that floated within the scarlet sword light. It was unknown whether it was Yang Juding's sword intent or the yin-yang sword light that forced Yang Juding's sword intent to revert back to a flying sword. Xiang Ming led the numerous golden core cultivators past the group of cultivators fighting against the sword formation and returned to the left side of the dragon-slaying slope. In the time it took for Xiang Ming and the rest to return, over 10,000 Dao sect disciples were killed by the green and red sword light. Seeing that there was no one around the left side of the dragon-slaying slope, Xiang Ming understood what Fairy Hong Xia meant. The slight anger he had towards Ming Yu and Fairy Hong Xia had already dissipated. Ming Yue. Xiang Ming pondered for a moment before instructing, "You and Kai Hongxia will lead a few foundation establishment disciples to the sword pillar and find out what's going on, yes?" Just as Ming Yu agreed, 2 green and red sword lights emitted a rumbling sound. Buzz. Yang Juding and Xiao Jie's figures appeared near the sword pillar. Xiao Jie's smile was like a flower as she said, "So it's fellow Daoist Xiang Ming from the Washing Flower sect? Welcome back." "Humph. Since when did a sword cultivator become a fellow Daoist of my Dao sect?" Xiang Ming sneered, but Xiao Jie continued to smile. "Look at what fellow Daoist Xiang Ming is saying. I thought that fellow Daoist missed me and specially came back to visit me." Bah. Xiang Ming spat out a mouthful of saliva and sneered. "Although I am not talented, how can I look down on an outsider? If you surrender to my Dao sect, this old man can still consider it." Xiao Jie was not someone who would compromise. She was only pretending to stall for time. How could she know that Xiang Ming's words were so unpleasant to hear? Naturally, she knew that she could not reply and could not say another word. Thus, she kept her mouth shut. "Hee, fellow Daoist Xiao Jie." Xiang Ming's interest was piqued as he laughed. "This old man does not mind your looks. If you have the heart, shut up." Xiao Jie sneered. The azure sword light around her flickered rapidly. She made a sword sign, and the small sword floating in front of her suddenly jumped out of the azure sword light like a fish and stabbed towards Xiang Ming. At the same time, a red brilliance also separated from the scarlet sword pillar where Yang Juding was and flew out of the sword pillar at almost the same time as Xiao Ming's small sword. The 2 small swords were like 2 birds who were willing to fly together. The moment they flew out of the sword pillar, they immediately snuggled together like 2 young men and women who were intimately attached to each other and flew towards Xiang Ming together. "Humph." Xiang Ming sneered. He stretched out his hand, and a spiritual talisman appeared in his hand. He said anxiously, "Fellow Daoists, the situation is urgent. We must not give the sword cultivator any chance to breathe." The spiritual talisman in Xiang Ming's hand suddenly expanded. With the activation of Xiang Ming's spiritual power, a palm of several feet in size flashed in the air. It was Xiang Ming's protective spiritual talisman, the Hand of the Nascent Soul. The Hand of the Nascent Soul had already appeared, and the surrounding area was shrouded by the power of the Hand of the Nascent Soul. Although the azure and red flying swords were unusually agile, under this extremely heavy imprisonment, they still could not move an inch, as if they had fallen into a quagmire. Seeing this situation, Xiang Ming was overjoyed and said with a smile, "This old man does not mind your looks as a sword cultivator. If you have the heart." Unfortunately, before Xiang Ming finished speaking, the azure sword light around Xiao Jie's body shone brightly. At the same time, a sword light separated from the sword pillar behind her and rushed towards the azure small sword. Almost at the same time as Xiao Jie, Yang Juding also pointed his finger. A sword light of several feet in size separated from the sword pillar and rushed towards the small scarlet sword. Hum! A loud sword cry rang out as the two swords suddenly expanded and shot towards the huge nascent soul hand to entangle it. Quick! Xiang Ming was slightly shocked, but he did not stop making hand seals. The huge hand slightly clenched and grabbed the two enlarged flying swords. Pa! There was a crisp sound like bamboo being broken. Yang Juding and Xiao Jie's faces turned pale. Humph! A cold snort came from above everyone's head. Meng Changshuo's body shone with azure and red brilliance. As the brilliance shone, an exquisite lantern appeared in the air. Hum! The exquisite lantern was right in between the crimson red and azure sword light. As the exquisite lantern emitted its brilliance, the sword light of the two sword pillars actually stopped, breaking off from the green and red sword light that was dozens of feet away, and converging on the exquisite lantern. Swoosh, like a peacock spreading its tail, the azure and red sword lights were like 7 rotating colors. They were extremely fast and powerful as they pierced towards the Dao sect cultivators. Not good. Not only was Xiang Ming shocked, but Ji Hong and the rest were also shocked. The sword lights piercing towards them were obviously very powerful. They were comparable to the full-strength attack of an illusory swordsman. If they did not use their full strength to counter it, they would definitely be hit by the azure and red sword lights. Rumble. There was a series of sounds. In the face of Ji Hong's defense, Li Zongbao's immortal piercing whip and Fairy Hong Xia's Xiantian primordial water, the azure and red sword lights did not weaken at all. Instead, they gained the upper hand. The azure and red sword lights even passed through Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand and merged with Yang Juding and Xiao Jie's sword lights. They almost broke Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand. However, the green-red sword light was only able to break through the defenses of the other cultivators. It was unable to harm them. Seeing that Xiang Ming's talisman was effective, De Sun raised his eyebrows. He turned to look at the others and shouted, "Fellow cultivators, success or failure depends on this." Yes. Zhong Huasong, Ji Hong, and the rest responded in unison. With a wave of their hands, numerous spirit talismans appeared in their hands. The dermic powers in their bodies were activated slightly. Immediately, brilliance of various colors emerged from the spirit talismans. Several powerful suction forces were also emitted at the same time. Waves of heaven and earth spiritual energy uncontrollably formed into hurricanes and frantically poured into the spirit talismans. One by one, large swaying hands slowly appeared in midair. Although the Yuanying hands had yet to be activated, the space within 100 feet of them had already solidified. An incomparably powerful aura suppressed Li Zongbao, Fairy Hong Xia, and the rest. Under this aura, the sword pillar that was like a heavenly jade pillar let out a loud roar. It sounded like a sorrowful cry, but also like a cry of struggle. At the same time, the red sword light and blue sword light inside the sword pillar trembled rapidly. Waves of sword energy shot out from the sword light and rushed around the nascent soul's hand, as if it was trying to resist the restriction. Yang Jioding and Xiao Jie were as calm as water. It was as if they already knew that this would happen. However, their eyes were filled with a strong desire to fight. Yang Jioding raised his head slightly and looked at Xiao Jie, who was in front of the azure sword lights. Xiao Jie met Yang Jioding's gaze and nodded slightly. As if they had a tacit understanding, the sword lights around the two of them became even more resplendent. The sword lights even covered the two of them. Then, a powerful suction force was released from their bodies. Woo-woo, two soft sounds were heard. The two small swords that were caught by Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand suddenly let out a sword cry. They struggled with all their might and fell into the suction force. Io! Xiang Ming was slightly stunned. The powerful suction force from the sword pillar had actually sucked the two flying swords away. That was not all. Just as the two flying swords rushed out of the nascent soul hand and approached the sword pillar, Yang Juding and Shou Jie's transformed flying swords also slowly rushed out of the sword pillar. The huge flying swords, one green and one red, had a sword light trailing behind them. This sword light was also connected to the sword pillar. In the blink of an eye, the two flying swords entered the giant sword pillar. The two flying swords let out a loud roar, and a powerful suction force came from the giant swords, shattering the suction force from the nascent soul hand. At the same time, there was an absolute sharpness within the suction force. As the two flying swords vibrated and flew, an unstoppable force formed at the tips of the two flying swords. This sharp force accelerated as the flying swords shot towards Xiang Ming's nascent soul hand. -11. Chapter 2668. You're courting death, Xiang Ming sneered. His whole body flashed with the same brilliance. The Dharma power in the Jindan rushed into the hand of the Yuanying. The hand of the Yuanying shook again and even flashed with layers of shadows. The big hand grabbed the two second-grade illusory swords. Rumble, a series of deafening explosions rang out incessantly. The light was dazzling, and the sound was ear-piercing. Li Zongbao and Fairy Hongxia sighed. Even De Sun, Shtong Huasong, and the others felt a sharp pain in their divine senses. It was as if they had been injured by the green and red sword radiance. Not good, Xiang Ming suddenly exclaimed. With a loud boom, a foot-long gap was blasted open on the thumb of the nascent soul's hand by Yang Jioding and Xiujie's flying swords. As soon as the gap appeared, it immediately expanded uncontrollably. The entire nascent soul's hand showed signs of collapsing. How could Xiang Ming dare to be negligent? He tried his best to activate his true yuan. The nascent soul's hand flashed with brilliance, trying to repair the gap. Wu, the two flying swords swayed slightly, as if they were preparing to attack. Then, they rushed towards Xiang Ming again. How dare you? At this time, De Sun's nascent soul's hand had already formed. He snorted coldly and also grabbed at the two flying swords. Unexpectedly, just as De Sun's nascent soul's hand reached out, the two flying swords suddenly turned around and rushed towards Ji Hong, who was the furthest away from Xiang Ming. Oh no! Ji Hong's nascent soul's hand had already been severely injured in the fight with LV Ruochang. At this time, it had just been summoned. The speed of absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth was not as fast as De Sun and Xiang Ming's, so it had not formed at all. Seeing the two flying swords turn towards her, she immediately had a bad feeling. While Ji Hong tried to activate her nascent soul's hand to block the flying swords, she also hurriedly patted her forehead, preparing to summon her magical weapon. Boom! At this time, the two flying swords suddenly sped up, far faster than before. Before Ji Hong could summon her magical weapon, the two flying swords had already pierced her nascent soul's hand. The two green and red sword radiances twisted together, and the nascent soul's hand was like a broken lantern, splashing brilliance in all directions. It was cut in half by the two sword radiances. That was not all. The sword light did not stop as the nascent soul's hand rumbled and swept towards Ji Hong's body. Ji Hong was almost scared out of her wits. She was only at the early stage of Jindan realm and could barely activate the hand of Yuanying. Previously, when she was fighting with LV Ruochang, her Jindan had already been damaged. Now, she was facing the yin and yang sword light of two second-grade illusory swordsmen. Within the sword light, the yin and yang shackled the spiritual power in her body, and the sharper sword qi cut her vitality into pieces. Instantly, Ji Hong's mind went blank. Even the magic treasure that she had yet to use remained in her body. Fellow Taoist Ji, Zhou Qingping from the Thousand Leaf Ridge, shouted anxiously from not far away. Perhaps this is what Taoist Qianmo is thinking. Ji Hong knew why she had to follow Xiang Ming to the center of the yin-yang sword formation. It was because her desire to kill LV Ruochong was too strong that she encouraged Hang Zhao to mobilize hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples to chase after the sword cultivator. If not for this old woman's stubbornness, right now, our Dao sect would definitely be celebrating. Jihang's return this time was originally because she had some thoughts. If she could not break this yin-yang sword formation, how could she face the elders of the Clear Leaf sect? However, she never expected that before she could even use one or two of her methods, the sword cultivator's yin-yang sword light would choose her first, and she did not even have the slightest strength to fight back. Forget it. Jihang's thoughts changed. She gritted her teeth and wanted to self-destruct to injure Yang Jioding and Xiujia. Unfortunately, she was still too optimistic. Just as she had this thought, the green and red sword light crossed in front of her and pierced through her body. Not even a drop of blood appeared. When the sword light flew away, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth swept past. With a pong sound, blood splattered everywhere. Jihang was actually split into two by the yin-yang sword light. Bitch, where do you think you're going? Thousand Leaf Ridge's Zhou Qingping had a good relationship with Jihang. Just now, he reminded Jihang. At this time, he shouted and urged his nascent soul hand to chase after the two flying swords. I will help you too. Qin Fan Valley's Su Zhuqi shouted and also chased after the two flying swords with a faint blue shadow hand. Seeing Jihang die, Xiang Ming was naturally shocked. At the same time, he also urged his nascent soul hand to block the two flying swords. It was as if the two flying swords had no way to escape under the imprisonment of these nascent soul hands. However, it was at this moment that the two flying swords suddenly shattered, transforming into two streaks of light that were even faster than lightning. Furthermore, the place where they were fleeing was not high up in the sky where the nascent soul cultivators had surrounded them. Instead, they rushed into the ground of dragon-slaying slope. What kind of sword cultivation secret technique is this? Xiong Huasong and the others were slightly surprised. Xiong Huasong and Desun's nascent soul hands had already formed. These two big hands did not block the two flying swords. Instead, they grabbed at the green and red sword pillars from the left and right. The sword chi on the sword pillars tried its best to resist, but the power of the nascent soul hands was too strong. The sword pillars began to shake gradually in the hands of the nascent soul. When Xiang Ming and the others saw Yang Jioding and Xiujia escape into the ground, they immediately split into two groups. Xiang Ming's big hands grabbed at the green sword pillars, while Zhou Qingping and Su Zhiqi's big hands slapped the ground. However, before the two of them slapped the dragon-slaying slope with their nascent soul hands, they heard a loud moo-moo sound coming from the ground of dragon-slaying slope. It was as if tens of thousands of bulls were crying out in unison. Boom! Just as this loud sound was produced, the two sword pillars began to tremble rapidly again. However, this time, they did not expand, but gradually contracted. In the blink of an eye, two huge swords condensed into the shape of swords and rushed out from the green and red sword pillars. Come! Xiang Ming shouted. His big hands suddenly grabbed the sword pillars that had shrunk to the size of a bowl. Wang, a loud sword cry came out from the sword pillars. Just as Xiang Ming and Xiong Huasong grabbed the red sword pillars, Yang Jioding's sword light rushed out from the hands of the two nascent souls. Naturally, Xiujia's sword light also rushed out from the hands of Desun's nascent soul. This doesn't seem to be just the strength of a second-grade illusory swordsman. The three of them were a little shocked. However, before they could recover from their shock, they noticed the abnormality in the sky. They saw that the exquisite lamp that Ming Changsho had transformed into had expanded several times under the green and red brilliance. The flying swords that Yang Jioding and Xiujia had transformed into actually rushed out from the sword pillars and flew towards the exquisite lamp. Moreover, the two sword pillars also followed the two sword lights towards the exquisite lamp. Boom! With a loud sound, as if an oil lamp had been lit, the two sword pillars rushed into the exquisite lamp. The entire exquisite lamp emitted a dazzling green and red brilliance. It illuminated the area within a radius of several li. Not good. Seeing such a change, Sun and the others were surprised and happy. They were happy because the two sword pillars that rushed into the exquisite lamp had lost contact with the green and red sword light in the sky. They had cut off the connection between the yin-yang sword formation's eye and the surroundings. Heng Zhao and the others could easily use their nascent soul hands to break through the formation's edge. But they were shocked because Yang Jioding, Xiujia, and Meng Changshu had done this. They definitely had a powerful backup plan. They would definitely have to use all their strength to deal with it. Perhaps, just as the thought appeared in their minds, the exquisite lamp that Meng Changshu had transformed into began to spin again. Dozens of green and red brilliance flew out from the exquisite lamp at the same time, piercing towards Sun and the others. Tisk tisk, the sword lights swept past, and the sound of them breaking through the air was extremely ear-piercing. Caw! A phoenix cry rang out. Fairy Heng Xia did not dare to hesitate any longer. Her ice phoenix spell body flew out of her body, and the Xiantian primordial water poured out layer after layer, surrounding the space around her. There were dozens of layers of Xiantian primordial water, if not hundreds of layers. Fairy Heng Xia had discovered that the Xiantian primordial water's defense against the yin-yang swordlight was limited, which was why she had racked her brains to come up with a countermeasure. Mingyu, Li Zongbao, and the other Golden Core and Foundation establishment cultivators who were close to Fairy Heng Xia did not hesitate as they quickly dodged under the Xiantian primordial water. Boom! The three sword lights hit the Xiantian primordial water. The sword lights shook rapidly within the primordial water, and the dozens of layers of Xiantian primordial water were about to break through. Caw! The ice phoenix spell body let out a mournful cry. Another sword light hit the left wing of the spell body, and a corner of the left wing was sliced off. Fairy Heng Xia also let out a loud cry as her body trembled rapidly. She could no longer control her spell body, and it shrank back into her body. Mingyu and Li Zongbao did not dare to delay as they quickly flew to the left side of Fairy Heng Xia and took out their magic treasures to protect her. At the same time, the Xiantian primordial water that had blocked the three sword lights was naturally kept back into the Ice Phoenix spell body. However, after being protected by so many layers of Xiantian primordial water, the sword lights were much slower, and their power was also much weaker. There was no need for Fairy Heng Xia to defend herself. Mingyu, Li Zongbao, and the rest who were protecting her worked together to destroy the three sword lights. However, the sword lights were much more powerful than before. The cracks on Mingyu's magic treasure were even larger, and Li Zongbao's immortal piercing whip was almost sent flying by the sword lights. With Fairy Heng Xia's Xiantian primordial water, Mingyu, Li Zongbao, and the rest were lucky. They knew that the yin-yang sword lights that had penetrated dozens of layers of Xiantian primordial water were still so powerful. What about those cultivators who did not have Xiantian primordial water protecting them? At the same time that the sword lights hit Fairy Heng Xia's Ice Phoenix spell body, the other yin-yang sword lights attacked Sun, Xiangming, and the rest under the control of the exquisite lamp. Almost at the same time, the yin-yang sword lights hit the talisman in the Yuanying's hand. Like a paper doll being cut by a pair of scissors, an extremely obvious crack appeared on the talisman. Sun and the rest were already prepared. The magic power in their bodies surged rapidly, and the light on their hands flashed violently. They clenched their fists tightly, trying their best to control the sharpness of the sword lights. Boom! After holding on for only a moment, Zhou Qingping and Su Zhouqi's hands collapsed, and the light was extinguished. After a loud boom, the green-red sword lights, like before, casually intersected with the two's bodies. As their protective golden light was extinguished, the two did not even have the chance to scream. They were dead. -11. Chapter 2669. Two golden core cultivators with protective talismans could not escape from the yin-yang sword radiance, much less those without talismans who could not hide under the connate primordial water. Under the two sword radiances, the two golden core cultivators were sliced in half, their corpses falling from the sky. Fortunately, the exquisite lamp could not control much of the yin-yang sword radiance. The remaining golden core and foundation establishment cultivators who were not attacked by the yin-yang sword radiance fled in all directions. Wu, Just as everyone was escaping, the yin-yang sword radiance in Xiangming, De Sun and Stong Huasong's hands let out a wail and gradually collapsed. Let's do it together. Seeing this, De Sun didn't care about the three sword cultivators who were gradually revealing themselves as the light of the exquisite lamp faded. He shouted loudly, and the three of them grabbed the two sword pillars with their talismans at the same time. It was as if three huge hands were really grabbing the two long flying swords. The green and red sword pillars, which were only as thick as a bowl, shook left and right in the hands of the three huge hands and actually showed signs of collapsing. The exquisite lamp's radiance was cold and lonely. Meng Changshuo's figure appeared. His face was pale and his body was trembling slightly. It was completely out of his control. On his left and right, Xiujia and Yang Juding's faces were emitting a dark red radiance and the other a dark green radiance. They did not look normal. The situation doesn't look good. Li Ying did not make a move. He flew to the left of Meng Changshuo to protect him and said softly, "I'm afraid my yin-yang sword formation can't." Just as Li Ying finished speaking, a faint loud sound came from afar. The four of them looked up and saw that the green and red sword radiance had disappeared. Hang Zhao and company must have defeated the enemy at the edge of the yin-yang sword formation. Forget it. Yang Juding sighed and said, "The talismans of the Dao sect cultivators are too powerful. They are comparable to a nascent soul cultivator's attack. We already expected this before we set up the formation. The three of you have already contributed a lot to the sword domain." Li Ying nodded and said, "This formation has killed tens of thousands of cultivators. We should be proud. Let's go." Meng Changshuo looked at the sword pillar that had been shaken by De Sun and the others and said, "The yin-yang sword has been controlled by a nascent soul. It won't be long before the eye of the yin-yang sword array is broken." "How can it be that easy?" Xiujia sneered. He opened his mouth and his intrinsic sword rushed out. "Sword friend Xiujia." Yang Juding was shocked. "If you lose this sword, I'm afraid your cultivation will fall to the first grade of the illusory sword realm." "So what if I'm a first-grade illusory sword?" Xiujia said coldly. "Even if I fall into the drawing sword realm, I'm still willing." "All right." Yang Juding clapped his hands and opened his mouth. A small crimson sword flew out and followed Xiujia's azure sword into the green and red sword pillar. What was different from before was that Xiujia's small azure sword had fallen into the scarlet sword pillar, while Yang Juding's small scarlet sword had fallen into the azure sword pillar. Rumble. The moment the two small swords entered the sword pillar, there was an explosion. Xiujia and Yang Juding's bodies went limp, and they almost collapsed in midair. Meng Changshuo and Li Ying did not dare to delay. They reached out to support the two of them and ignored the crowd of cultivators as they rushed into the sky. The sword pillar exploded from where the two small swords entered and began to collapse. Even the nascent soul hands of De Sun and the others were unable to stop or restrain it. As the sword pillar fell, the green and red sword beams around the yin-yang sword array also began to collapse and fell along with the sword pillar. "Oh no, dodge." Seeing this, Xiangming immediately shouted. He extended his nascent soul hands and covered an area of 100 feet. De Sun, Stong Huasong, and the rest also understood. Several nascent soul hands flew out and covered an area of 100 feet, protecting Fairy Hong Xia and the rest. Even the fleeing Golden Core and Foundation establishment cultivators hurriedly flew back. In the blink of an eye, the sword pillar completely collapsed and fell into the dragon punishing slope. Following this, the entire dragon punishing slope shook violently, even more than when the sword beams appeared. Seeing tens of thousands of cyan and red sword lights flying out of the ground, those cyan and red flying swords flying out of the yin-yang sword formation also flew out and slapped towards the entire yin-yang sword formation within a radius of tens of miles like a tidal wave. Screams of agony rang out incessantly, almost like a purge. Cultivators below the middle stage of Foundation establishment were unable to withstand the final wave of yin-yang sword qi alone. Another several thousand cultivators fell. After the miserable shriek sounded, the terrifying green-red sword light that was dozens of miles away had completely disappeared. I'm afraid the yin-yang sword array has been broken by our combined efforts." Xiang Ming, De Sun, and the rest retracted their nascent soul hands. Under their protection, the dozens of cultivators following them did not suffer any losses. Even if it's broken, we've also suffered heavy losses. Xiong Huasong's face was gloomy. He knew in his heart that the low-level cultivators who could survive in the Yin-Yang sword array were few and far between. The sword cultivator had set up this Yin-Yang sword array with the intention of killing all the cultivators. Quickly, meet up with fellow Taoist Hung Ming and the rest. Xiang Ming instructed a few disciples to collect the corpses of Ji Hong and the rest. With a wave of his hand, he led the group towards the edge of the Yin-Yang sword array. Although it was only a short few miles, the tragic scene along the way was really unbearable to look at. Not only was the smell of blood in their mouths and noses, but the bloodstains on the ground and the dismembered limbs made one feel as if this was not the human world. In the many years of the Great Tao battle, none of the great arrays were as tragic as this one. Fairy Hong Xia's Dharma body was injured by the Yin-Yang sword beams, and her own body was also injured. Her body flew slightly slower and was almost at the back. Seeing this scene, she could not help but sigh. Our Tao sect cultivators have suffered too many casualties, but that hateful sword cultivator did not even leave behind a corpse. Mingyu and Li Zongbao did not fly too far away and stood guard beside her. Mingyu did not understand Li Zongbao's eagerness. Previously, she had not seen Li Zongbao and Fairy Hong Xia's relationship. However, when she thought of Li Zongbao's reputation in the three kingdoms of cultivation and Fairy Hong Xia's beauty, she naturally understood. She smiled and replied, "The sword cultivators are all hiding behind the sword array. Even if they were killed by us, their corpses would not be exposed in the sword array. Furthermore, the sword array does not only depend on one's strength, it also depends on one's luck. Everything else aside, if not for Martial Niece Hong Xia's Xiantian primordial water, Martial Niece Zongbao and I would have died too." Fairy Hong Xia's expression darkened as she said softly, "I naturally understand what Martial Aunt Mingyu is saying. Although I am a little disgusted by this battle, seeing the corpses everywhere, I can't help but hate the sword cultivators. I can't wait to kill them all. I can't wait to see the corpses of sword cultivators everywhere. Only then can I quench the hatred in my heart." Li Zongbao's expression was still indifferent as he looked straight ahead. He did not participate in the conversation between the two. Mingyu looked at Li Zongbao and said softly, "Martial Niece Zongbao, you are famous in this battle and have killed countless sword cultivators. Do you have such thoughts?" "All right, Martial Anne understands." Li Zongbao replied indifferently, "Under the great Tao, all are ants. In the great battle, all are vengeful spirits. If I don't kill the sword cultivators will kill me. There's no other way." "Thank you, Senior Li." Fairy Hong Xia understood Li Zongbao's words and said softly. Mingyu felt that this was a good opportunity and wanted Li Zongbao to talk more with Fairy Hong Xia. However, Fairy Hong Xia did not say anything else after a thank you. Li Zongbao's expression was even colder. Mingyu could not help but sigh. However, before she could think about it, Mingyu frowned and said, "The sword array is filled with the corpses of our Tao sect cultivators. Why don't the surviving disciples collect the corpses? Now that the sword array has been destroyed, even if there were hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators, they would not dare to face hundreds of thousands of cultivators directly, right?" Martial Aunt Mingyu. Li Zongbao glanced at the expression on Mingyu's face and explained, "According to my master, this array has more than one layer. If we collect the corpses now, there will be enough space for the sword cultivators to set up the array. We might as well do it in one go." "What? There's still a sword array?" Mingyu did not think as far as Hung Hung and the rest. She could not help but cry out. Li Zongbao laughed bitterly in his heart, but there was no change in his expression as he replied, "Everything is just a guess. Now, it's time to uncover the mystery." Mingyu looked ahead doubtfully. They had returned from the dragon-slaying slope. Although their flying speed was not slow, it could not be compared to the disciples who had been advancing towards the west side of the sword array. After the Yin-Yang sword array was destroyed, they had rushed out of the Yin-Yang sword array like a tidal wave and had long disappeared. The Yin-Yang sword array is already so powerful. Sword cultivators, What other tricks do they have? Fairy Hong Xia's face showed a trace of fear. If it was anyone else, even if it was Mingyu, Li Zhongbao might not answer this question. But Fairy Hong Xia was Kai Zhuoxia's sister and Xiao Hua's lover. Li Zhongbao had to answer. Black Sky Sect's martial uncle Xiong Huasong was able to set up the 10-direction annihilation array. The magic within is far beyond my imagination. I believe that sword cultivator LV Ruochong might not lose to martial uncle Xiong. For a moment, everyone was silent. LV Ruochong had led tens of thousands of swordsmen to destroy the golden annihilation array. This had long changed everyone's impression of sword cultivators as barbaric. The yin-yang sword array just now would no longer be looked down upon. Just at this moment, the rumbling sound rose again. It was still coming from all directions, and it was pushing towards the direction of dragon-slaying slope. As expected, no one spoke, but this sentence rang in everyone's heart at the same time. Furthermore, everyone's face changed color. Let's go quickly. Mingyu placed her hand on Fairy Hong Xia's shoulder and said, "Don't use your powers. I'll bring you along." "Thank you, martial uncle." Fairy Hong Xia expressed her gratitude. The three of them increased their speed and flew towards the west side. Run. The three of them flew for a moment and met a large group of cultivators who were fleeing in panic. Everyone was panicking and had long lost their formation when they were fleeing. There were even a few cultivators who were shouting loudly. -11.